Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that has echoed through 10,000 years of war, whispered in the corridors of fortress monasteries, and debated in the shadowed halls of the Inquisition. It is a question that has no answer, or perhaps too many answers, and that is precisely the way one particular soul wanted it to be. The question is simple. Who is Alpharius? Ask that question to 100 scholars of the Imperium, and you will receive 100 different answers. Some will tell you he was the last of the Emperor's sons to be discovered, a latecomer to the grand endeavor known as the Great Crusade. Others will insist he was actually the first, hidden away in plain sight, while his brothers were scattered across the stars. A few, those who have dug too deep into forbidden archives and redacted histories, and might lean close and whisper that Alpharius was not one being at all, but two. Twin souls sharing a single purpose, two minds operating behind a single name, a secret so profound that even the master of mankind may or may not have been aware of it. And that is just the beginning. That is just the surface of a mystery that runs so deep and so dark that trying to untangle it is something akin to reaching your hand into a nest of vipers and hoping to pull out only one. Everything about the Primarch of the 20th Space Marine Legion, the Alpha Legion, is wrapped in layers of deception so thick that even 10 millennia of scholarship and interrogation and psychic probing have failed to peel them all away. The truth about Alpharius, if such a thing even exists, it is perhaps the most jealously guarded secret in a galaxy absolutely drowning in secrets. So settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we are going to try something that wiser minds have warned against. We are going to try to tell the story of Alpharius Omegon, the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion. We are going to wade through the contradictions and the deliberately planted falsehoods and the layers upon layers of misdirection, and we are going to see what, if anything, solid ground looks like beneath all that fog. I cannot promise you certainty. Nobody can, not when it comes to the Alpha Legion. But I can promise you one of the most fascinating and deeply unsettling stories in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Before we begin to unravel the specific tale of Alpharius and his hidden twin, it helps to understand why this particular Primarch matters so much. In a setting filled with demigod warriors and galaxy-spanning conflicts, what makes one more Primarch special? The answer lies in what Alpharius represents. Every one of the Emperor's 20 sons embodied some aspect of warfare, some facet of what humanity needed to reconquer the stars. Rabut Gilliman was the statesman and the organizer. Leman Russ was the executioner and the savage hunter. Rogel Dawn was the unbreakable defender. Lionel Johnson was the consummate knightly general. Each of them had a role, a purpose, a place in the grand design. Alpharius was the spy, the saboteur, the knife in the dark that you never saw coming. He was the part of warfare that most people prefer not to think about. The part that involves deception and manipulation, and the willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone, including the truth itself, in pursuit of victory. If the other Primarchs were the Emperor's swords and shields and hammers, Alpharius was the poison slipped into the enemy's cup long before the battle ever began. And that makes him dangerous in a way that none of his brothers could quite match. Because you can see a sword coming. You can brace yourself against a shield. You can hear the fall of a hammer. But poison works in silence, and by the time you notice it, the damage is already done. This is the story of a Primarch who elevated deception to an art form, a being who could walk among his own legionaries and go completely unrecognized, not because he was ordinary, but because he had made himself appear so. A commander who would spend years, sometimes decades, laying the groundwork for a single operation. A strategist who understood that the greatest victory is the one your enemy never even realizes they lost. And above all else, this is the story of a secret, the greatest secret of the Alpha Legion, the one truth that was guarded more fiercely than any fortress or any relic, the truth that Alpharius was not alone. he never was. Let us begin at the beginning, or at least at what passes for a beginning when you are dealing with a being whose entire existence was designed to resist easy categorization. To understand Alpharius Omegon, we need to go back to the very dawn of the Imperium, to a time before the Great Crusade, before the Space Marine legions as we know them, before even the Primarchs themselves walked among humanity. Well, we need to go back to a laboratory buried beneath the Himalayan mountains of ancient Terra, where the most ambitious genetic engineering project in the history of the human species was being carried out by the most powerful psyker ever born, the Emperor of mankind, that enigmatic and impossibly ancient figure who had guided humanity's development from the shadows for millennia, had a plan. It was audacious in the extreme. He intended to create 20 genetically engineered superhuman beings, each one a masterwork of biological science, enhanced by the application of psychic power, and, if certain whispered accounts are to be believed, bargains struck with forces that even the Emperor might not have fully understood. These beings would be the Primarchs, and each one would serve as the genetic template for a legion of Space Marines. The transhuman warriors who would form the backbone of the Emperor's armies as he set out to reunite the scattered remnants of humanity across the galaxy. The project was carried out in absolute secrecy. Even the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor's first generation of enhanced soldiers, were not told the full extent of what was being created in those subterranean laboratories. The Primarchs were gestated in specially designed pods, each one carefully monitored and adjusted to achieve specific characteristics. One would be a master of siege warfare. Another would embody the fury of the berserker. A third would possess psychic abilities rivaling those of the most powerful psykers in history. Each Primarch was a unique creation, tailored for a specific purpose in the grand design of the Great Crusade. And then something went wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The forces of chaos, those malevolent entities that dwell in the psychic dimension known as the warp, became aware of what the Emperor was doing. Perhaps they sensed the enormous psychic power being channeled into the Primarch project. Perhaps they had their own agents and informants among the Emperor's court. Whatever the means of their discovery, the ruinous powers acted with terrible decisiveness. They reached through the barrier between the material universe and the immaterium, and they tore the Primarch pods from the Emperor's laboratory, scattering them across the galaxy like seeds thrown to the wind. It was a devastating blow. Years of work, the very foundation of the Emperor's plan for humanity's future, scattered in an instant to the furthest corners of a galaxy that was, at that time, still largely hostile and unexplored. Each Primarch pod came to rest on a different world, and each infant Primarch would grow up shaped by the environment and culture of whatever planet had become their unwitting foster home. Some landed on civilized worlds and were raised by noble families. Others crashed down on death worlds where survival itself was a daily struggle. The specific circumstances of each Primarch's upbringing would go on to shape their personality, their methods of war, and ultimately their loyalty or treachery during the Great Civil War that was still centuries away. But here is where the story of Alpharius begins to diverge from the standard template. Because with the 20th Primarch, nothing was standard, nothing was simple, and the very circumstances of his origin are so disputed, is so layered with contradictory accounts and deliberate misinformation, that trying to establish what actually happened is like trying to hold water in your fists. The official imperial record, such as it is, states that Alpharius was the last of the Primarchs to be discovered, found only a few decades before the end of the Great Crusade. According to this account, he was located in a nameless system at the galaxy's edge, leading a ragtag fleet of primitive spacecraft in what amounted to a one-man war of piracy and conquest. It was Horus Lupercal, the first Primarch to be found, and the Emperor's most favored son, who encountered Alpharius in this remote corner of space. The story goes that Alpharius used his tiny fleet of 1- and 2-man fighters to cleverly outmaneuver the advanced ship of Horus's Lunar Wolves fleet, forcing Horus himself to intervene. When the two finally met face to face, Horus recognized his lost brother and welcomed him into the fold. It is a tidy story, a neat, self-contained narrative that fits comfortably into the established chronology of the Great Crusade. And there is a very good chance that almost none of it is true, because there is another account, one that comes from a far more problematic source, but one that carries with it a ring of authenticity that is difficult to dismiss entirely. This account comes from Alpharius himself, recorded in his own words in a document so unreliable that it opens with the declaration, "I am Alpharius. This is a lie." According to this version of events, related in what is known as the account from the Primarchs series by Mike Brooks, Alpharius was not the last Primarch to be discovered. He was the first. When the Chaos Gods scattered the Primarch pods across the galaxy, Alpharius's pod did not travel far. It came to rest on Terra itself, relatively close to the Emperor's own laboratory. The Emperor found the infant Primarch almost immediately, and rather than announcing the discovery to the fledgling Imperium, made a fateful decision. He chose to keep Alpharius secret. Why? Because the Emperor, with characteristic foresight, realized that he might never find all of his scattered sons. He needed a contingency, a hidden weapon that could operate in the shadows while his other sons conquered worlds in the light. Alpharius would be that weapon. He would be the Emperor's hidden sword, raised in secrecy and trained for a very specific purpose. While his brothers were being found on distant worlds and presented to the Imperium with great ceremony, Alpharius was being educated in the arts of covert warfare by none other than Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor and the Regent of Terra. Think about what that means for a moment. While Horus was learning to be a general on Chthoniya, while Gilliman was building an empire on Macragge, while Russ was running with the wolves on Fenris, Alpharius was sitting in quiet rooms on Terra, learning from arguably the most cunning and politically sophisticated mind in the entire Imperium. Malcador taught him to hide his thoughts from psychers. He taught him to move unseen in plain sight. He taught him to think in layers, to always have a plan within a plan within a plan. In essence, Malcador was shaping Alpharius into the perfect intelligence operative, a being who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outdeceive any opponent he might encounter. And Alpharius was an eager student. His innate gifts, the superhuman intellect and perception that all Primarchs possessed, were perfectly suited to this kind of training. Where other Primarchs might have chafed at the secrecy, might have yearned for the glory of open warfare and public adulation, Alpharius embraced the shadows. He understood, perhaps more intuitively than any of his brothers, that the most effective weapon is the one your enemy does not know exists. The young Primarch put his training to use almost immediately. According to his own account, Alpharius infiltrated the Imperial Palace itself, slipping past the security measures maintained by the Legio Custodes, as the Emperor's personal bodyguard of genetically engineered warriors who were, in many ways, the most dangerous fighters in the Imperium. He did this not to cause harm, but to demonstrate the flaws in the palace's defenses, to show that even the most formidable fortifications could be breached by someone with sufficient skill and cunning. The only being to nearly detect him during these infiltrations was Constantine Valdor, the Captain General of the Legio Custodes and one of the most formidable warriors ever produced by the Imperium. Even Valdor, whose senses and instincts were honed to an almost supernatural degree, could not quite pin down the identity of the intruder. He sensed that something was wrong, that someone was where they should not be. But Alpharius was too skilled, too well trained in the arts of concealment, to be caught outright. These incursions into the palace's security reportedly led to the creation of the Blood Games, the ongoing series of tests in which members of the Custodes attempted to infiltrate the palace themselves in order to identify and address weaknesses in its defenses. If this account is true, it means that one of the most important security traditions in the entire Imperium was inspired by the activities of a Primarch, whose very existence was a state secret. But here is the thing that makes this story so maddeningly difficult to accept or reject outright. The source is Alpharius himself. And if there is one thing that every account of the 20th Primarch agrees upon, it is that Alpharius was a liar. Not a petty liar, not a liar by weakness or habit, but a liar by design and conviction. Whose deception was not just a tool for Alpharius, it was a fundamental aspect of his nature, woven into his very being, as deeply as the genetic code that made him a Primarch. So when Alpharius tells you that he was the first Primarch found, that he was raised in secret on Terra, that he trained under Malcador, what do you do with that information? Do you accept it as a rare moment of honesty from a being who made dishonesty into an art form? Or do you recognize it as yet another layer of deception, a false truth designed to mislead anyone who might uncover it? The honest answer is that we do not know. And that uncertainty, that permanent fog of ambiguity that surrounds every aspect of Alpharius's existence, is perhaps the most Alpha Legion thing about the entire story. The 20th Primarch does not give you answers. He gives you options. And every option contains within it the possibility of being a carefully designed lie. What we can say with somewhat more confidence is what happened after Alpharius made himself known to the wider Imperium. Because regardless of whether he was the first Primarch found or the last, regardless of whether he grew up on Terra or on some unnamed world at the galaxy's edge, there came a point when Alpharius stepped out of the shadows and into the light. And when he did, he brought with him a secret that would define not only his own existence, but the entire character and purpose of his legion. That secret was Omegon. Now, the existence of Omegon is arguably the single most important piece of the Alpha Legion puzzle, and it is also one of the most fiercely debated. Here is what we know, or at least what the most credible accounts suggest. Alpharius was not a single being. He was one half of a twin, a pair of identical Primarchs who shared a connection so deep and so fundamental that they described themselves as one soul inhabiting two bodies. This was not a metaphor. This was not poetic exaggeration. By all accounts, Alpharius and Omegon possessed a genuine psychic bond that allowed them to share thoughts, perceptions, and even, according to some sources, swap consciousness between their bodies. How this came to be is the subject of considerable speculation. One possibility is that the Emperor deliberately engineered twin Primarchs, creating a matched pair for reasons known only to himself. Perhaps he foresaw the need for a Primarch who could be in two places at once, who could lead from the front, while simultaneously coordinating operations from behind the scenes. A twin Primarch would be the perfect answer to this need, capable of fighting on one battlefield while directing a completely separate campaign halfway across the galaxy. The other possibility, and the one that most accounts seem to favor, is that the twinning was an accident. When the Chaos Gods scattered the Primarch pods, the enormous psychic forces involved might have caused the 20th Primarch's developing embryo to split, creating two identical beings from what was intended to be one. This would mean that Omegon's very existence was the result of chaos intervention, a twist of fate that the Emperor might not have anticipated or even been aware of. Whatever the cause, the twins apparently spent at least some portion of their early existence separated from one another. According to the account given in the novel by Mike Brooks, Alpharius was raised on Terra by the Emperor and Malcador, while Omegon was either on another world entirely or existed in some other circumstance that kept the twins apart. Both apparently sensed the existence of the other, a persistent feeling of incompleteness that drove them to search for their missing half. The reunion of the twins is described as taking place during the Rangdan Xenocides, one of the most devastating and least documented conflicts of the Great Crusade. The Rangdan were a Xenos species so dangerous that the Imperium nearly lost the war against them, suffering casualties on a scale that dwarfed most other campaigns of the era. It was during this conflict, in the chaos and confusion of fighting an enemy that threatened the very survival of the nascent Imperium, that Alpharius finally located his brother. The world was called Barsaver, and the path to reaching it was not an easy one. According to one account, Alpharius had to fight his way through the nightmarish xenos, known as the Slough, worm-like creatures of terrible power and cruelty, before he could reach his twin. The Slough had been preying on worlds in the region, and Omegon had been battling them on his own, a lone Primarch waging a shadow war against an enemy that most of the Imperium did not even know existed. When the twins finally stood face to face, the recognition was instant and overwhelming. These were not strangers meeting for the first time. They were two halves of a whole coming together at last, a split soul reuniting after years of searching. The bond between them solidified in that moment, and from that point forward, Alpharius and Omegon operated as a single entity wearing two faces. One soul in two bodies, united in purpose and linked by a connection that transcended normal understanding. They made a decision together in the wake of their reunion, a decision that would shape everything that followed. They would reveal themselves to the Imperium, but they would do so on their own terms. Only one of them would step into the light. The other would remain hidden, a secret known only to themselves and, potentially, to the Emperor. Alpharius would be the public face of the 20th Legion, the Primarch that the rest of the Imperium would know and interact with. Omegon would be the shadow, operating unseen, directing operations from behind the curtain. A second Primarch whose very existence was a weapon. And so it was Omegon, according to their own account, who actually boarded Horus's flagship and introduced himself as Alpharius, the last Primarch to be found. It was Omegon who used the ragtag fleet to cleverly challenge the Lunar Wolves, forcing Horus to intervene personally. It was Omegon who stood before the War Master and allowed himself to be presented to the Imperium as the 20th son of the Emperor. The real Alpharius, if we accept this version of events, was somewhere else entirely, watching from the shadows as his twin played the role that they had rehearsed together. This is the fundamental deception upon which the entire Alpha Legion was built. Not just a military tactic, not just a strategic advantage, but an existential lie woven into the very identity of the Legion and its command structure. From the moment of their public revelation, Alpharius and Omegon switched places constantly. Sometimes it was Alpharius who appeared at war councils and led armies into battle. Sometimes it was Omegon wearing his brother's name and face. The other Primarchs, the Emperor's own sons, could not tell the difference. The Custodes could not tell the difference. It is debated whether even the Emperor himself knew the truth, although given his immense psychic power, it seems likely that at least some awareness of the twins' nature was present, even if the specifics remained obscure. The twins were described as being physically identical in almost every way. Both were slightly copper-skinned, bald, and possessed of a heavy brow that gave them a superficial resemblance to their brother Horus. Their eyes were striking, seeming to shift color from a cold Arctic blue to a shimmering green depending on the light and, perhaps, their mood. Unlike most Primarchs, who towered over their space marines by a considerable margin, Alpharius and Omegon were only slightly taller than the largest Astartes in their legion. This relatively modest size, by Primarch standards, was a deliberate advantage. It meant that either twin could, with minimal effort, disguise himself as an ordinary legionary and move through the ranks of his own legion completely unrecognized. This was not something that any other Primarch could do. Horus could not pretend to be a regular lunar wolf. Guilliman could not pass for an ordinary ultramarine, but Alpharius could walk among his sons as one of them, observing, listening, directing from within rather than from above. And this capability extended to the legionaries themselves. The Alpha Legion went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that all of its members resembled their Primarch as closely as possible. Marines were encouraged to shave their heads, and genetic factors in the Alpha Legion's gene seed produced warriors who tended towards similar physical features, the same copper-tinged skin, the same build, the same general appearance. The result was a legion in which every individual looked roughly the same, and where the Primarch could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. The implications of this for enemy intelligence were devastating. How do you identify the commander of an army when every soldier in that army looks identical? How do you plan a decapitation strike when you cannot determine which of 10,000 identical warriors is actually the Primarch? The answer in practice was that you could not. Trying to locate Alpharius within the ranks of his own legion was like trying to identify a specific drop of water in an ocean. It simply was not possible. And the Alpha Legion leaned into this confusion with deliberate enthusiasm. They developed a tradition, a ritual that was part battle cry and part philosophical statement. I am Alpharius. That was what every legionary would say when asked to identify themselves. Not I serve Alpharius or I fight for Alpharius, but I am Alpharius. It was not just arrogance or deception, though it was certainly both of those things. It was an expression of the Legion's fundamental belief that identity was fluid, and that the individual mattered less than the collective, and that every member of the 20th Legion carried within them some fragment of their Primarch's purpose and will. For their enemies, this was maddening. Imagine fighting a war against an opponent, where every prisoner you capture, every spy you intercept, every officer you interrogate, gives you the same answer to every question. I am Alpharius. It made intelligence gathering virtually impossible. It turned every interaction with the Alpha Legion into an exercise in frustration and uncertainty. And that, of course, was exactly the point. Now, with the twins reunited and the Alpha Legion formally joined to the Great Crusade, let us look at what happened next. Because it is in the campaigns and conflicts of the Great Crusade that we begin to see the true character of Alpharius Omegon, the methods they employed, the enemies they made, and the cracks that would eventually lead them to make the most consequential decision of their lives. Now, before we move forward from the origins and into the campaigns of the Great Crusade, I want to pause here and really explore something that sets the Alpha Legion apart from every other fighting force in the Imperium. Because understanding the Alpha Legion requires understanding not just what they did, but how they thought. And the way they thought about warfare, about identity, about the relationship between a commander and his soldiers, was fundamentally different from anything else in the history of the Space Marine legions. Every legion had a culture. The Space Wolves had their Fenrisian pack mentality, their mead halls, and their sagas, and their barely contained barbarism wrapped in a veneer of brotherhood. The Ultramarines had their Macragborn devotion to order and efficiency, their endless codification of tactics and procedures, their belief that victory came through discipline and systematic application of force. The Dark Angels had their knightly orders and their secrets. The Night Lords had their terror tactics. The Iron Hands had their obsession with replacing weak flesh with strong iron. The Alpha Legion had none of these things, and all of these things simultaneously. You see, one of the most distinctive characteristics of the 20th Legion was their practice of studying, absorbing, and incorporating the tactics and techniques of every other legion they encountered. They were intellectual omnivores, consuming the strategic doctrines of their brother legions with the same voracity that a librarian might consume books. They studied the siege tactics of the Iron Warriors. They analyzed the rapid assault doctrines of the White Scars. They dissected the psychological warfare techniques of the Night Lords. They examined the defensive methodologies of the Imperial Fists and the combined arms operations of the Ultramarines. But they did not simply copy these approaches. They adapted them, modified them, twisted them into something uniquely their own. When an Alpha Legion commander employed siege tactics, they were not the same siege tactics that Perturabo would have used. They were siege tactics filtered through the Alpha Legion's philosophy of misdirection and deception, transformed into something that only superficially resembled the original. The Alpha Legion did not just learn from their brothers. They weaponized their brothers' own methods against any enemy foolish enough to assume they could predict how the 20th Legion would fight. This intellectual flexibility was both a strength and a weakness. It meant that the Alpha Legion could adapt to virtually any tactical situation, deploying the right tool for the right job with a versatility that no other legion could match. But it also meant that the Alpha Legion lacked the deep, instinctive mastery that came from devoting an entire culture to a single approach. A space wolf in close combat was a force of nature, how centuries of cultural conditioning and genetic predisposition combining to produce a warrior who fought hand to hand with an efficiency that could not be replicated through study alone. An alpha legionary in the same situation would be competent, probably very competent, but they would lack that same primal edge. The Alpha Legion compensated for this through preparation, obsessive, meticulous, sometimes borderline pathological preparation. Before every campaign, before every operation, the Alpha Legion would gather intelligence on their target with a thoroughness that bordered on the compulsive. They did not just want to know the enemy's military dispositions. They wanted to know the names of the enemy commander's family members. They wanted to know the supply routes for the civilian markets. They wanted to know the shift schedules at the water purification plants and the maintenance cycles of the power grid. They wanted to know everything, because in the Alpha Legion's philosophy of war, knowledge was the foundation upon which every victory was built. This intelligence-gathering apparatus was not limited to the legionaries themselves. The Alpha Legion made extensive use of human operatives, ordinary men and women who were recruited, trained, and deployed as agents of the 20th Legion. These operatives came from every walk of life and were embedded in every stratum of society. Some were willing volunteers, drawn to the Alpha Legion's cause by ideology or ambition. Others were unwitting pawns, manipulated into serving the Legion's purposes without ever understanding who they were really working for. And some were sleeper agents, individuals who had been conditioned and programmed years or even decades in advance, living ordinary lives until the moment their activation code was transmitted and their true purpose was revealed. The use of human operatives was not unique to the Alpha Legion. Other legions employed scouts, informants, and intelligence assets to varying degrees, but no other legion made human operatives such a central part of their operational doctrine. For most legions, human agents were supplementary, useful, but not essential. For the Alpha Legion, they were foundational. The Legion's entire approach to warfare depended on having a network of agents in place long before the first shots were fired. Agents who could provide intelligence, carry out sabotage, foment dissent, and then create the conditions of chaos that the Alpha Legion would then exploit. This reliance on human operatives had an interesting and often overlooked consequence. It meant that the Alpha Legion was, paradoxically, the legion most closely connected to ordinary humanity. While other legions existed in splendid isolation from the baseline humans they were sworn to protect, the Alpha Legion worked with humans on a daily basis. Their operatives were human. Their intelligence networks were staffed by humans. Their plans depended on understanding human societies, human psychology, human vulnerabilities and strengths. In many ways, the Alpha Legion understood humanity better than any of their brother legions, because they had to. Their methods required it. There is an irony in this that is worth noting. But the Legion most deeply connected to humanity was also the one willing to sacrifice humanity for the greater good, if the Cabal's prophecy is to be believed. The twins who understood humanity best were the ones who accepted the possibility of humanity's extinction as the price of defeating chaos. Whether this represents the ultimate expression of love for humanity, the willingness to destroy what you love most in order to save what you love most, or the ultimate betrayal, remains one of the most debated questions in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Let me take a moment to discuss the physical characteristics and the equipment of the twin Primarchs in more detail, because these aspects of their nature are both fascinating and deeply revealing. As mentioned earlier, Alpharius and Omegon were the shortest of the Primarchs, yet only slightly taller than the largest of their legionaries. This was an enormous tactical advantage. Every other Primarch was a towering figure who stood head and shoulders above his sons, impossible to miss on a battlefield, a walking target for enemy snipers and assassins. Alpharius and Omegon could disappear into a crowd of their own legionaries, like a snake disappearing into tall grass. One moment you saw a Primarch, the next you saw only a sea of identical helmeted faces, and the Primarch was gone. Their physical appearance reflected this philosophy of concealment. Both twins were bald, copper-skinned, and heavy-browed, with striking eyes that seemed to shift between Arctic blue and shimmering green. They bore a superficial resemblance to Horus, which made a certain genetic sense since all the Primarchs were derived from the Emperor's own genetic material and thus shared some family resemblance. But where Horus was unmistakably a Primarch, radiating charisma and authority from every pore, Alpharius and Omegon cultivated an appearance that was, by Primarch standards, deliberately understated. The Alpha Legion reinforced this effect by requiring all of its members to emulate their Primarch's appearance as closely as possible.
And honestly, if I can just step outside the lore for a second here, this is the part of the Alpha Legion story that genuinely gets under my skin. Because most faction in 40k, you can kind of pin down what they are, where the Ultramarines stand, what the World Eaters want. But with Alpharius and Omegon, every single time I sit down to research them, I walk away less certain than when I started. And I have been down this rabbit hole more times than I can count. Every source contradicts another source. Every answer opens 3 more questions. And the wildest part is that Games Workshop did that on purpose. The ambiguity is the point, that is the lore. And I think this is what makes the Alpha Legion the most rewarding faction to dig into. Because there's no neat little bow at the end. You just have to sit with the uncertainty and decide for yourself what you believe. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
Legionaries shaved their heads. The gene seed of the 20th Legion, which was classified at the highest level by the Emperor himself, produced warriors who tended towards similar physical characteristics. The same copper-tinged skin, the same build, the same general facial structure. The result was a legion that presented a face of almost eerie uniformity, 10,000 identical warriors, any one of whom might be the Primarch in disguise. When Alpharius did choose to reveal himself, when the moment called for the dramatic entrance of a Primarch rather than the subtlety of a hidden hand, he wore a suit of artificer armor known as the Pythian Scales. This armor was a masterwork of the armorer's art, crafted in the image of the Hydra, the multi-headed serpent that served as the Alpha Legion's icon and symbol. The leg plates, chest piece, and arm guards were covered in textured scales that gave the armor a reptilian appearance, as if the wearer had been swallowed by a great serpent and was now wearing its skin as a shield. 4 aggressive Hydra heads, spiked and fanged and utterly menacing, snaked around the armor's backpack, creating an image of barely contained predatory violence. A cloak woven with camellia line, a material that could shift its appearance to blend with the surrounding environment, hung from the armor's shoulders, embroidered at its hem with intricate depictions of Hydras. The overall effect was imposing without being ostentatious, a Primarch's armor that spoke of deadly purpose rather than vain glory. It was a statement piece, but the statement it made was not "look at me," but rather "fear me." The weapon most associated with Alpharius was the Pale Spear, an artifact whose origins are as mysterious as the Primarch who wielded it. The Pale Spear was a large, 2-handed weapon ending in 2 vicious, barbed prongs, designed to both impale and rend whatever it struck. It was described as being of unknown provenance, which in the context of the Imperium's vast arsenal of weapons technology suggests something truly extraordinary. Some scholars have speculated that the Pale Spear might be of Xenos origin, perhaps an artifact recovered during the Great Crusade and presented to Alpharius as a trophy or gift. Others have suggested that it might be an artifact of the Dark Age of technology, one of the incomprehensible weapons created during humanity's technological golden age before the Age of Strife. Whatever its origin, the Pale Spear was a fearsome weapon. It could penetrate virtually any known form of armor, and the wounds it inflicted were said to be impossible to heal through normal means. Even the enhanced regenerative abilities of a Primarch might not be sufficient to recover from a wound dealt by the Pale Spear. And it was this weapon that Alpharius wielded in his fatal duel with Rogel Dawn, and it was this weapon that Dawn turned against his brother in the final moments of that battle, using it to deliver the killing blow. In addition to the Pale Spear, Alpharius was known to carry a master-crafted plasma blaster on his belt, a weapon capable of delivering devastating energy blasts at close range. The Alpha Legion also made use of a specialized weapon known as venom spheres, advanced assault grenades that replaced the standard frag grenades used by other legions. These venom spheres contained crystalline splinters impregnated with toxins that could incapacitate or kill even heavily armored targets. Some accounts suggest that the toxin technology employed in venom spheres was based on Xenos science, one which would be entirely consistent with the Alpha Legion's willingness to adopt alien technology when it served their purposes. The elite warriors of the Alpha Legion were the Lernaean Terminators, named after the Lernaean Hydra of ancient Terran mythology. These were the grinding jaws of the multi-headed serpent, the unstoppable force that descended upon the enemy's most critical assets and tore them apart with methodical, calculated violence. Clad in cataphracti pattern Terminator armor, the heaviest and most protective variant available, the Lernaeans were equipped with Volkite chargers and power axes, a combination that gave them devastating firepower at close range and terrifying lethality in hand-to-hand combat. The Lernaean Terminators served as the Alpha Legion's shock troops, their primary task being the swift isolation and destruction of the enemy's most powerful units and assets. They were masters of the teleportation assault, materializing directly in the midst of enemy formations and launching devastating attacks before the defenders could react. What set them apart from similar elite units in other legions was not just their fighting prowess, but their psychological impact. The Lernaeans were designed to break the enemy's will as much as their bodies, striking with such calculated brutality that the psychological shock of their appearance was often as devastating as the physical damage they inflicted. Few outside the Alpha Legion knew of the Lernaeans' existence, not because the Legion concealed them, but because they rarely left survivors to report what they had encountered. This was not ruthlessness for its own sake, but a deliberate operational decision. The fewer people who knew about the Lernaean Terminators, the fewer people could prepare defenses against them. Secrecy was its own form of armor, and the Alpha Legion wore it as comfortably as they wore their ceramite plate. Now, I spoke earlier about the Rangdan Xenocides and the reunion of the twins on the world of Bar Saver. But this conflict deserves considerably more attention than I initially gave it, because it is in the fires of the Rangdan War that many of the key relationships and events that would shape the twin Primarchs' future were forged. The Rangdan Xenocides represent one of the darkest and most heavily redacted chapters in the history of the Great Crusade. The Rangdan were a Xenos species of such terrible power and such existential threat that the Imperium nearly lost the war against them. The details of this conflict have been extensively suppressed by Imperial authorities, to the point where much of what we know comes from fragments, allusions, and accounts that were only partially preserved. What we do know is that the Rangdan War consumed enormous Imperial resources and inflicted staggering casualties. Entire expeditionary fleets were destroyed. Multiple Space Marine legions were drawn into the conflict, and at least one of the two lost legions, the 2nd and the 11th, may have been involved in the fighting and may have suffered their mysterious fate during or as a result of the Rangdan campaigns. It was during this period of desperate warfare that Alpharius, operating undercover and without publicly acknowledging his identity as a Primarch, made contact with Lion L. Johnson and the Dark Angels. According to the accounts we have, Alpharius identified himself by name but denied being a Primarch, a characteristic piece of misdirection that allowed him to offer assistance to the First Legion without revealing the full truth of his nature. Some accounts suggest that Alpharius saw Lion L. Johnson as a potential ally, perhaps even as a candidate for the position of War Master, a role that would eventually go to Horus. The Lion shared some of Alpharius's appreciation for secrecy and covert operations, and the First Legion had its own tradition of hidden knowledge and concealed inner circles. Of all the Primarchs, the Lion might have been the most sympathetic to Alpharius's methods, and the Alpha Legion Primarch reportedly believed that the Lion was the Primarch most like himself. Whether this assessment was accurate or another example of Alpha Legion misdirection is open to debate. But the contact with the Dark Angels during the Rangdan Xenocides is significant because it represents one of the few documented instances of Alpharius attempting to build a genuine alliance with another Primarch before the outbreak of the heresy. If Alpharius truly saw the lion as a kindred spirit, it suggests a degree of loneliness in the 20th Primarch's existence, a desire for understanding and acceptance that his philosophy of permanent deception normally prevented him from expressing. It was also during the Rangdan Xenocides that Alpharius received the intelligence he had been waiting for, information about the location of another being like himself, a warrior of immense power fighting alone against the nightmarish Xenos known as the Sloth. Following this lead through the chaos of the Rangdan war zone, Alpharius eventually fought his way to the world of Barsaver, battling through Sloth forces to reach his destination. The Sloth were among the most horrifying Xenos species encountered during the Great Crusade. They were worm-like creatures of vast intelligence and terrible cruelty, known for their habit of consuming their victims and absorbing their knowledge and memories. The Sloth were ancient, possibly older than the Eldar, and their technology was advanced in ways that the Imperium could barely comprehend. Some accounts describe them as partially or wholly necrotic, beings of living death that existed in a state somewhere between life and unlife. On Barsaver, Omegon had been fighting these creatures alone, waging a one-man guerrilla war against a species that had consumed worlds. When the twins finally found each other, the recognition was instantaneous. There was no period of uncertainty, no need for verification or proof. They knew each other with a certainty that transcended physical recognition, as if the reunion had been inevitable from the moment of their separation. The conversations that took place between the twins following their reunion are not recorded in detail, but we can infer some of what was discussed from the decisions that followed. Alpharius and Omegon agreed that the time had come to reveal themselves to the Imperium at large, but they would do so while keeping the nature of their dual existence hidden. One of them would be the public face of the 20th Legion. The other would remain in the shadows. They also discussed the Emperor. According to some accounts, the twins were uncertain whether the Emperor was aware of Omegon's existence. They speculated that the Emperor might have deliberately kept them separated, or that their separation might have been a consequence of the Chaos God's interference in the scattering of the Primarchs. The truth, if either twin ever discovered it, has not been shared with the wider Imperium. What is clear is that from the moment of their reunion, the twins operated as a seamlessly coordinated pair. They developed the practice of switching identities, of having Omegon appear as Alpharius and vice versa, until even they seemed to find a certain fluid enjoyment in the confusion. The line between Alpharius and Omegon blurred with each passing campaign, the brothers coming to see themselves as one soul inhabiting two bodies, a single consciousness distributed across two physical forms. This fluidity of identity was not merely a tactical advantage, though it certainly was that. It was a philosophical statement about the nature of selfhood and the relationship between the individual and the collective. In a galaxy where identity was fixed and immutable, where you were defined by your gene seed and your legion and your Primarch, the Alpha Legion offered a radical alternative. Identity was not fixed. It was not permanent. It was something that could be assumed and discarded, worn and removed like a set of armor. You were not born into who you were. You chose who you were, moment by moment, and that choice could change at any time. This philosophy extended from the Primarchs down to the lowest-ranking legionary. Every Alpha Legionary was trained to operate independently, to make decisions and take action based on their own assessment of the situation, rather than waiting for orders from a superior. This was not indiscipline. It was a deliberate, operational philosophy, one that recognized that in the kind of fluid, fast-moving, deception-heavy warfare the Alpha Legion practiced, rigid chains of command were a liability. A legionary who needed permission to act was a legionary who could not exploit a sudden opportunity or respond to an unexpected threat. An alpha legionary who could think and act independently was a weapon that could be deployed anywhere, in any situation, and trusted to pursue the legion's objectives without constant supervision. The result was a legion that was, in organizational terms, closer to a network than a hierarchy. Information flowed laterally rather than vertically. Decisions were made at the lowest appropriate level, rather than being pushed upward through layers of command. Individual Marines and small units were given broad operational objectives and then trusted to determine the best way to achieve them. The Primarchs provided strategic direction, but the implementation of that strategy was distributed across the entire legion. This organizational philosophy is what allowed the Alpha Legion to continue functioning after the loss of its Primarchs. And other legions, organized around rigid hierarchies with the Primarch at the apex, were devastated when that apex was removed. The Alpha Legion, organized as a distributed network, could absorb the loss of any individual node, even the most important one, and continue to function. The network adapted, reorganized, and continued to pursue its objectives, because the objectives had been internalized by every member of the network, not held exclusively by the leadership. It was, in many ways, the most resilient organizational structure in the entire Space Marine system. And it was the direct expression of the twin Primarchs' philosophy, that the individual mattered less than the collective, that the name Alpharius belonged to everyone and to no one, and that the Hydra could survive the loss of any number of its heads, because the will that animated them was shared by all. This brings us to a discussion of one of the most enigmatic aspects of the Alpha Legion's existence, their relationship with the Emperor's original design for the 20th Legion. Because there are tantalizing hints in the historical record that the Alpha Legion was not simply another fighting force in the Emperor's arsenal, it was something different, something special, something that the Emperor created for a very specific purpose that may not have been shared with any of the other Primarchs. The Alpha Legion was one of the 3 Trefoil Legions, along with the Space Wolves and the Salamanders. These 3 legions were endowed with notably distinct and highly classified gene seed, and the details of which were known only to the Emperor himself. What made the Trefoil gene seed different from the gene seed of the other 17 legions is unknown, but the fact that it was classified at such an extraordinarily high level suggests that it contained something unusual, something that the Emperor did not want the wider Imperium to know about. The Alpha Legion's gene seed was specifically the last strain created for the Legiones Astartes, produced at the very end of the Unification Wars. Some scholars have speculated that this late creation date is significant, that it suggests the Alpha Legion was developed after the Emperor had learned something from the creation and deployment of the earlier legions, something that prompted him to create a final legion with different characteristics and a different purpose. The first 4 decades of the Great Crusade saw the 20th Legion existing as what was essentially a ghost legion, a force that was never publicly announced, never officially acknowledged, and that operated in obscure war zones far from the front lines of the Great Crusade. The few warriors of the 20th carried out assassinations, acts of espionage and sabotage, and the recovery of unknown artifacts. They sometimes operated under the heraldry of other legions or with no identifying heraldry at all. They left no witnesses to their activities. This is not the behavior of a conventional military formation. This is the behavior of a black operations unit, a force created specifically for covert warfare and deniable operations. The implication is that the Emperor created the Alpha Legion to be his intelligence service, by his special forces, his spy masters and saboteurs. While the other legions conquered worlds through open warfare, the 20th Legion was supposed to operate in the shadows, handling the dirty work that the Emperor needed done, but could not afford to be publicly associated with. If this is true, it casts the entire history of the Alpha Legion in a different light. Their obsession with secrecy was not a quirk or a character flaw. It was their designed purpose. Their practice of concealing their identity and operating through proxies was not mere paranoia. It was what they had been created to do. And the twin Primarchs, with their ability to swap identities and their obsessive cultivation of deception, were the perfect commanders for such a force. Beings who were literally designed to be invisible. And some have even suggested a darker possibility, that the Alpha Legion was created not just for covert operations against the Imperium's external enemies, but also for internal security purposes. A secret legion, answerable only to the Emperor, whose primary function was to monitor the other legions and their Primarchs for signs of treachery or corruption. If this speculation is correct, then the Alpha Legion's study of other legions' tactics and organizational structures was not just intellectual curiosity, it was intelligence gathering, the systematic cataloging of strengths and weaknesses that could be exploited if one of the other legions ever needed to be brought to heel. This theory, while unproven, would explain several otherwise puzzling aspects of the Alpha Legion's history. One, it would explain why the Emperor kept the 20th Legion secret for so long. It would explain why the Alpha Legion's gene seed was classified at the highest level. It would explain why Alpharius was trained by Malcador, the Imperium's spy master, rather than being publicly presented to the Imperium like his brothers. And it would add an extra layer of bitter irony to the Alpha Legion's eventual betrayal, because it would mean that the Legion created to prevent treachery was itself the one that committed the most ambiguous and confusing act of treachery in the Imperium's history. But these are speculations, and the Alpha Legion has always been more about questions than answers. Let us move forward. Oh, let me elaborate further on one of the most iconic and most misunderstood aspects of the Alpha Legion. The phrase, "I am Alpharius," and the operational concept known as the harrowing, because both of these elements reveal more about the twin Primarchs' philosophy than almost anything else in the Legion's history. I am Alpharius. These three words are perhaps the most famous battle cry in all of Warhammer 40,000, and they are also among the most frequently misunderstood. Casual observers often dismiss the phrase as a simple deception tactic, a way of confusing the enemy about the identity of the Legion's commander. And it is that, certainly. But it is also much more. When an Alpha Legionary says, "I am Alpharius," he is not simply lying about his identity. He is making a philosophical statement about the nature of individuality and the relationship between the self and the collective. In the Alpha Legion's worldview, the individual Marine is not a separate entity with his own identity and his own importance. He is a manifestation of the Legion's collective will, a single cell in a vast organism that acts with unified purpose. When he says, "I am Alpharius," he is expressing the belief that the Primarch's will, the Primarch's purpose, the Primarch's genius lives within every member of the Legion. He is not claiming to be the physical being known as Alpharius. He is claiming to embody the principle that Alpharius represented. This is a radical concept within the framework of the Space Marine legions. Other legions revered their Primarchs as something approaching divine figures, more being so far above ordinary Marines that the gap between them was almost infinite. The relationship between Primarch and Legionary in most legions was one of worship and obedience, a hierarchy so steep that the individual Marine could never hope to approach, let alone equal, the being who had created him. The Alpha Legion turned this hierarchy on its head. By declaring that every Marine was Alpharius, the twins were not diminishing themselves. They were elevating their sons. They were saying that the gap between Primarch and Legionary was not as wide as everyone assumed, that the qualities that made Alpharius great were distributed among all members of the Legion, and that any individual Marine, given the right circumstances and the right information, could act with the same strategic brilliance and the same decisive authority as the Primarch himself. This was not mere flattery or motivational rhetoric. It was an operational necessity. The Alpha Legion's methods required every member of the Legion to be capable of independent thought and action. A Marine on a deep cover infiltration mission, embedded within an enemy organization for months or years, could not wait for orders from above. He had to make decisions on his own, based on his own assessment of the situation, using his own judgment about what the Legion's objectives required. To do this effectively, he had to be able to think like the Primarch. He had to internalize the Primarch's strategic philosophy so completely that his decisions would be indistinguishable from the ones the Primarch himself would have made. I am Alpharius was the expression of this internalization. It was not a lie, it was a truth, viewed from the Alpha Legion's particular angle of reality. Every Marine who said those words was declaring that the Primarch's mind lived within his own, that the Hydra's will flowed through every cell of its multi-headed body. The harrowing was the operational expression of this philosophy taken to its ultimate conclusion. When the Alpha Legion committed to a full-scale assault, when the months or years of preparation and infiltration had been completed, and the moment for overt military action had arrived, the result was not a conventional battle. It was something closer to an avalanche, a sudden, overwhelming, multi-directional eruption of violence that struck the enemy from every conceivable angle simultaneously. As a harrowing would typically begin with the simultaneous activation of every sleeper agent, every covert operative, every embedded infiltrator in the target area. Infrastructure would fail without warning as saboteurs destroyed power grids, communications networks, and transportation hubs. Key leaders would be assassinated in their beds, their offices, their command centers. Chaos cults that had been carefully cultivated over years would rise up in coordinated revolt, overwhelming local security forces and creating pandemonium in the streets. Then, before the defenders could even begin to understand what was happening, the Alpha Legion's military forces would strike. Not in one place, not along a single axis of advance, but from every direction at once. Drop pods screaming out of the sky, armored columns emerging from concealed positions, the infantry appearing from underground passages that had been excavated months in advance. The enemy, already reeling from the collapse of their infrastructure and the loss of their leadership, would find themselves under assault from 100 different directions, each attack coordinated with all the others to create maximum confusion and prevent any kind of organized resistance. The psychological effect of a harrowing was devastating. Defenders who might have fought bravely against a conventional assault simply collapsed when confronted with the harrowing's overwhelming chaos. It was not that the Alpha Legion brought more firepower or more soldiers to the fight. In most cases, they actually committed fewer Marines than other legions would have deployed for a comparable objective. The devastating effect came from the completeness of the preparation, the simultaneity of the attack, and the utter destruction of the enemy's ability to understand what was happening to them and mount a coherent response. This was not warfare as most people understood it. It was something closer to surgery, the precise, calculated dismemberment of a target's ability to function as a coherent entity. By the time the shooting stopped, the target was not just defeated, it was destroyed, its institutions shattered, its leadership eliminated, its population so demoralized and confused that resistance was not just futile, but unthinkable. The harrowing was the Alpha Legion's masterwork, the culmination of everything the twin Primarchs believed about warfare and the relationship between preparation and execution. But it was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a demonstration of what could be achieved when superhuman intelligence was applied to the art of war without any of the moral constraints that limited other commanders. The Alpha Legion did not fight fair. They did not believe in fair. They believed in effective, and the harrowing was the most effective military operation ever devised by any Space Marine Legion in the history of the Great Crusade. Other Primarchs might have found the harrowing distasteful. Guilliman certainly did, viewing it as needlessly complex and morally questionable. Dawn considered it dishonorable, a betrayal of the principles that should govern the conduct of the Emperor's warriors. But even those who disapproved of the harrowing's methods could not deny its results. Worlds fell to the Alpha Legion in days that would have taken other legions months to conquer. Entire sectors were brought into compliance with minimal casualties on both sides because the harrowing broke the enemy's will so completely that prolonged resistance was simply not possible. This efficiency was not achieved through kindness or restraint. The Alpha Legion was perfectly willing to employ extreme measures when they believed those measures were necessary. But they were also capable of something that many of their brother legions were not: discrimination. They could distinguish between targets that needed to be destroyed and targets that could be preserved, between populations that needed to be subdued and populations that could be co-opted. The harrowing was a scalpel, not a hammer, and the Alpha Legion wielded it with a precision that spoke to both their intelligence and their fundamental understanding of how human societies functioned. This understanding, this deep familiarity with the mechanisms of human civilization, was what made the Alpha Legion truly unique among the Space Marine legions. Most legions fought wars. The Alpha Legion managed societies. They understood that a planet was not just a military objective, but a complex system of interconnected institutions, relationships, and power structures, and that victory was achieved not by destroying that system, but by taking control of it. The harrowing was the instrument of that control, the mechanism by which the Alpha Legion seized the levers of power and redirected them to serve the Imperium's purposes. Whether this approach was ultimately beneficial or harmful to the worlds it was applied to is a question that the twin Primarchs probably never asked themselves. They were pragmatists, not moralists. The results spoke for themselves, and the results were consistently impressive. Under the Alpha Legion's direction, worlds that might have resisted Imperial compliance for years or decades were brought into the fold in a matter of weeks. Resources that might have been wasted in prolonged sieges were preserved for the Imperium's use. Populations that might have been decimated by conventional military operations were left largely intact, available as a labor force and a tax base for the growing Imperium. The cost, of course, was trust. Worlds that had been conquered through deception and manipulation did not develop the same kind of loyalty to the Imperium as worlds that had been brought into compliance through open negotiation, or even through honest military defeat. There was always a lingering resentment, a sense of having been violated rather than liberated, that could fester for generations and potentially provide fertile ground for future rebellion. But that was a problem for the future. The Alpha Legion dealt in the present, in the immediate and the practical, and in the present their methods worked. They worked brilliantly, consistently, and devastatingly. And that was all that mattered to the twin Primarchs and the Legion they had shaped in their image. The Alpha Legion entered the Great Crusade like a blade being drawn from its sheath for the first time. They were young, the youngest of all the legions in terms of active service under their Primarch, and they burned with a desire to prove themselves. But the manner in which they sought to prove their worth was fundamentally different from anything the Imperium had seen before. While other legions sought glory in the crash of direct battle, in the thunderous charge and the heroic last stand, the Alpha Legion waged a different kind of war entirely. To understand the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare, you need to understand a concept that modern military thinkers call full-spectrum dominance. It is the idea that victory is not achieved through a single decisive battle, but through the systematic dismantlement of an enemy's ability to fight. You do not simply destroy their army. You destroy their supply lines, their communications, their political leadership, their economic infrastructure, their will to resist. By the time the actual shooting starts, the enemy should already be defeated. The battle itself is merely the final act of a drama that has been playing out for weeks, months, or even years before the first shot is fired. This was the Alpha Legion's doctrine, and they pursued it with a dedication that bordered on obsession. Before a single legionary set foot on a target world, the Alpha Legion's intelligence operatives would have been there for months, sometimes years, laying the groundwork. They used human agents, not just Astartes, to infiltrate the target society at every level. These agents would foment dissent among the population, sabotage critical infrastructure, assassinate key leaders, and plant disinformation designed to turn different factions within the enemy society against each other. By the time the Alpha Legion actually launched their military assault, the target world was already in chaos. Its defenses compromised, its leadership either dead or discredited, its population confused and demoralized. The final phase of an Alpha Legion campaign was known as the Harrowing, and it was a thing of terrible, calculated beauty. Having spent months or years undermining the enemy from within, the Alpha Legion would suddenly strike from every direction simultaneously. Not a concentrated thrust at a single point, not a predictable advance along a single axis, but a seemingly random eruption of violence across the entire theatre of operations. Attacks would come from the front, the flanks, the rear, or from inside supposedly secure positions, from forces that the defenders did not even know existed. The impression created was one of being overwhelmed by an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once, an enemy that seemed to know your plans before you made them, and your weaknesses before you discovered them yourself. It was devastatingly effective. World after world fell to the Alpha Legion's approach, often with significantly fewer casualties on both sides than would have been expected from a conventional military campaign. The Alpha Legion did not fight wars of attrition if they could avoid it. They fought wars of information, wars of deception, wars of systemic collapse. Their victories were not measured in enemy dead or territory captured, but in the speed and completeness with which the target society's ability to resist was dismantled. This approach required fewer Marines per expeditionary fleet than other legions typically deployed. Where other legions might commit thousands of Astartes to a planetary compliance, the Alpha Legion could achieve the same result with a fraction of that number, supplemented by networks of human agents and covert operatives. This efficiency allowed the 20th Legion to participate in a remarkable number of campaigns simultaneously, lending their expertise to expeditionary fleets across a vast swathe of the galaxy. But it also created problems, significant problems. Because the Alpha Legion's methods, for all their effectiveness, were not universally admired among their fellow legions. In fact, and some of their brother Primarchs were openly contemptuous of the 20th Legion's approach to warfare. The most notable and most consequential of these rivalries was with Reboot Guilliman, the Primarch of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines. Guilliman was, in many ways, the antithesis of Alpharius. Where Alpharius valued secrecy and misdirection, Guilliman valued clarity and systematic organization. Where the Alpha Legion operated through layers of deception and covert manipulation, the Ultramarines followed carefully documented and standardized procedures. Guilliman believed in the systematic application of military force, in detailed planning and precise execution. He had literally written the book on how to wage war, a document that would eventually evolve into the legendary Codex Astartes, and the foundational military doctrine of the Space Marine chapters in the millennia that followed the heresy. When Guilliman looked at the Alpha Legion, he saw chaos. Not the metaphysical chaos of the warp, but organizational chaos. A legion that seemed to operate without clear structure, without predictable doctrine, without the kind of standardized procedures that Guilliman believed were essential to long-term military effectiveness. The Alpha Legion's methods struck him as unnecessarily complicated, overly reliant on deception, and fundamentally unsound. He saw a legion that was more interested in proving how clever it was than in achieving its objectives efficiently. The tension between the two Primarchs came to a head during the Great Crusade, culminating in a confrontation that has been described in various sources as everything from a heated argument to a near-physical altercation. Guilliman publicly chastised Alpharius for what he perceived as the cruelty and inefficiency of the Alpha Legion's methods, and he did so in a way that was calculated to humiliate. He pointed to the Ultramarines' own record of conquests, a record that was impressively long and consistently successful, and essentially told Alpharius that his legion could never hope to match it. There was some justification for this criticism, at least on the surface. The Ultramarines had been active for far longer than the Alpha Legion and had brought hundreds of worlds into compliance. Their record was impeccable. But what Guilliman failed to appreciate, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the difference in context. The Ultramarines had been operating for roughly 2 centuries longer than the Alpha Legion. Comparing their accumulated record of conquests was like comparing the career statistics of a veteran athlete to those of a rookie, and then concluding that the rookie was inferior. The comparison was technically accurate, but fundamentally misleading. More importantly, Guilliman seemed unable or unwilling to recognize the strategic value of the Alpha Legion's methods. He saw the deception and the subterfuge as complications, as unnecessary additions to what should be a straightforward military operation. What he did not see, or did not want to see, was that the Alpha Legion's approach often achieved results that conventional military force could not. A world infiltrated and subverted by Alpha Legion operatives could be brought into compliance with minimal destruction of its infrastructure and population, preserving valuable resources for the Imperium. A world conquered by conventional military assault, by contrast, often suffered enormous damage that took decades or centuries to repair. The argument between Alpharius and Guilliman was never resolved. The two Primarchs parted on bitter terms, with Alpharius reportedly believing that Guilliman hated him and resolving to have nothing further to do with the Ultramarines Primarch. It was a rift that would have devastating consequences in the millennia to come, contributing to the deadly confrontation at Escrador that we will discuss later in this account. Guilliman was not the only Primarch to take issue with the Alpha Legion's methods. Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, was another vocal critic. Dawn was a builder and a defender, a Primarch whose genius lay in the construction of impregnable fortifications and the systematic organization of defensive operations. Like Guilliman, he valued directness and transparency. The idea of winning through deception struck him as fundamentally dishonorable, a betrayal of the principles that should guide the conduct of the Emperor's sons. Dawn criticized Alpharius during the World Prince campaign, a conflict that perfectly illustrates the philosophical divide between the two Primarchs. During this campaign, Alpharius had the opportunity to capture the enemy's capital quickly and with minimal casualties. Instead, he deliberately held back, allowing the enemy time to organize their defenses. And only when they had established a competent defensive position did the Alpha Legion launch their assault. The resulting battle raged for a full week, during which approximately 90% of the defending forces were destroyed before the planetary nobility surrendered. Many Primarchs condemned this approach as needlessly cruel and wasteful. Why allow the enemy to prepare defenses that then had to be overcome at great cost? Why prolong a conflict that could have been resolved quickly? But Alpharius had a different perspective entirely. From his point of view, the World Prince campaign was not about capturing a single planet. It was about sending a message. By allowing the enemy to organize their best possible defense and then systematically dismantling it, the Alpha Legion demonstrated that resistance was not just futile, but pointless. But the word of this defeat spread across the region, and dozens of other worlds surrendered without a fight, choosing compliance over a conflict they knew they could not win. Alpharius was thinking in terms of strategic impact, of the ripple effects that a single campaign could generate across an entire sector. His brothers, for the most part, were thinking in terms of the individual engagement. It was a fundamental difference in perspective, and it meant that the Alpha Legion was perpetually misunderstood by most of the other legions. They saw Alpharius as needlessly complicated, as someone who preferred cleverness over effectiveness. Alpharius saw his brothers as short-sighted, as warriors who could win battles, but often failed to grasp the larger strategic picture. There was one Primarch, however, who understood Alpharius. One brother who appreciated the value of cunning and the power of the well-executed stratagem. That Primarch was Horus Lupercal, the War Master himself. Horus was the first Primarch to be found by the Emperor, and he had been the Emperor's right hand throughout the early decades of the Great Crusade. He was a commander of extraordinary charisma and tactical brilliance, a leader who inspired fanatical loyalty in his followers and genuine respect even among his rivals. Unlike Guilliman or Dawn, Horus did not see the Alpha Legion's methods as a weakness. He saw them as a unique strength, an asset that could be deployed in ways that complemented the more conventional approaches of the other legions. Under Horus's patronage, the Alpha Legion flourished. The War Master gave the 20th Legion increasing freedom to operate independently, authorizing them to pursue their own objectives and employ their own methods without the oversight that other legions were subjected to. The Alpha Legion used this freedom to expand rapidly, building up their strength and extending their network of agents and operatives across a vast expanse of the galaxy. They established intelligence networks that penetrated deep into enemy territory, planted sleeper agents on worlds that had not yet been contacted by the Imperium, and developed a logistical infrastructure that allowed them to sustain operations far beyond the normal reach of the Great Crusade's supply lines. This relationship with Horus would prove to be one of the defining factors in the Alpha Legion's eventual decision to side with the traitors during the Horus heresy. But it was not the only factor, and it was arguably not even the most important one, because the true catalyst for Alpharius Omegon's turn from the Emperor's service was not personal loyalty to Horus. It was something far stranger, far more complex, and far more troubling. It was the Cabal. Approximately 2 standard years before the outbreak of the Horus heresy, while the Alpha Legion was supporting the Imperial Army's compliance of a world called Nurth, something extraordinary happened. The twin Primarchs were approached by a human agent named John Grammaticus, who served as the representative of an organization unlike anything the Imperium had ever encountered. John Grammaticus was himself remarkable. He was a perpetual, one of a rare breed of humans who possessed the ability to regenerate from virtually any injury, including death itself. His lifespan was effectively unlimited, and he had been alive for thousands of years, accumulating knowledge and experience across the breadth of human history. But Grammaticus was not acting on his own behalf. He was the front man for the Cabal. The Cabal was a multi-species alliance of ancient and incredibly powerful alien beings. Its members included Eldar, those ancient and psychically gifted aliens whose civilization predated humanity's by millions of years, as well as representatives of other species even more ancient and mysterious. Some of the Cabal's members were described as resembling mechanical life forms. Others appeared to be composed of pure energy. One member, known as Gahet, belonged to a reptilian species whose origins were so ancient that they predated even the Eldar. What united this disparate collection of beings was a shared purpose. They had devoted their existence to combating what they called the primordial annihilator, the force that humans knew as chaos. For longer than humanity had existed as a species, the Cabal had been working to understand and counter the influence of the chaos gods, those malevolent entities that dwelt in the warp and fed upon the emotions of sentient beings. The Cabal's knowledge of chaos was vast, far surpassing anything that the Imperium possessed, and it was this knowledge that they brought to Alpharius Omegon in the hope of shaping the outcome of the coming civil war. The Cabal had been studying the Primarchs for decades, using their own psychic abilities and predictive technologies to analyze the roles that each of the Emperor's sons would play in the events to come. They had determined that the 2 most important Primarchs were the oldest and the youngest, Horus and Alpharius. Horus, because he would be the instrument of Chaos's attack on the Imperium. Alpharius, because he was, in the Cabal's view, the key to determining the outcome of that attack. What Horus would do, they claimed, Alpharius would undo. Through their agent Grammaticus, the Cabal arranged a meeting with the Alpha Legion's Primarch on the world of Aeolith, roughly 18 months before the heresy began. What transpired at that meeting would alter the course of galactic history. The Cabal possessed an extraordinary ability known as the Acuity, a form of prophetic vision that allowed them to foresee possible futures with remarkable clarity. Using this ability, they presented Alpharius Omegon with 2 possible outcomes for the coming civil war, 2 futures that branched from the decisions made during the conflict. The first future showed the Alpha Legion remaining loyal to the Emperor. In this timeline, the forces of the Imperium would eventually prevail. Horus would be defeated, but at a terrible cost. The Emperor himself would be mortally wounded, his broken body placed inside the cybernetic sarcophagus known as the Golden Throne. Neither truly alive nor truly dead, the Emperor would be trapped in a state of endless agony, unable to guide humanity, but too vital to the Imperium's psychic infrastructure to be allowed to die. Without the Emperor's active leadership, the Imperium would enter a long, slow decline. Over the course of 10 to 20,000 years, it would gradually decay, its institutions becoming rigid and corrupt, its people becoming fearful and superstitious, until eventually chaos would return resurgent and consume everything. Humanity, the Imperium, the galaxy itself, all of it would be swallowed by the forces of the warp. The second future was far more terrible in the short term, but contained within it a glimmer of hope for the long term. In this timeline, the Alpha Legion would side with Horus. Their involvement would help ensure the War Master's victory over the Emperor. Horus would kill his father and seize control of the Imperium. But then something unexpected would happen. The last remaining shred of Horus's nobility, of the part of him that had genuinely loved his father and believed in the Emperor's vision for humanity, would reassert itself. Consumed by guilt and self-loathing at what he had done, Horus would turn his fury inward, lashing out at the very forces of chaos that had corrupted him. The resulting conflict would be devastating, consuming humanity within 2 to 3 generations. But in destroying itself, humanity would also destroy the emotional and psychic fuel that the Chaos Gods fed upon. Without humanity's emotions to sustain them, the Chaos Gods would wither and die. The galaxy would be saved from the primordial annihilator, but at the cost of humanity's complete extinction. 2 futures, one leading to a slow, agonizing decline and eventual annihilation, the other leading to immediate destruction but the permanent defeat of chaos. And neither future was good. Neither offered anything resembling a happy ending. But the Cabal presented the second option as the lesser of 2 evils, arguing that the permanent destruction of chaos was worth any price, even the extinction of the human race. Think about what it must have been like for Alpharius and Omegon to receive this information. These were beings who had been created for the express purpose of serving humanity, of protecting the human race and ensuring its survival. And now they were being told that the best thing they could do for the galaxy, the most meaningful contribution they could make, was to betray everything they had been created to defend and actively work toward humanity's destruction. The twins deliberated. We do not know how long they debated the Cabal's proposition or how heated their discussions became. Some accounts suggest that Alpharius and Omegon may not have been entirely in agreement about the correct course of action, that one of the twins was more willing to accept the Cabal's logic than the other. This is significant because it suggests that the 2 halves of the twin Primarch, for all their shared purpose and psychic bond, were capable of independent thought and disagreement. They were one soul in 2 bodies, but those 2 bodies had their own perspectives and their own moral compasses. In the end, Alpharius Omegon accepted the Cabal's proposition. They would side with Horus. They would work to ensure the War Master's victory, and in doing so, they would condemn their own species to extinction in the hope that this sacrifice would rid the galaxy of chaos forever. It was, depending on your perspective, either the most selfless act in human history or the most monstrous betrayal imaginable. The twin Primarchs were willing to sacrifice everything, not just their own lives, but the lives of every human being in the galaxy, for the greater good of eliminating the Chaos Gods. They believed, or at least they claimed to believe, that this was what the Emperor himself would have wanted if he had been presented with the same choice. The Emperor, after all, was no stranger to sacrifice. He had sacrificed his own freedom, his own desires, his own humanity, in pursuit of a future for the species he was sworn to protect. Was it really such a stretch to believe that he would approve of the ultimate sacrifice, the extinction of humanity itself, if it meant the permanent defeat of humanity's greatest enemy? Or were the twins simply wrong? Or were they manipulated by a collection of alien beings who had their own agenda, their own reasons for wanting humanity to destroy itself? The Cabal, after all, was not composed of humanity's friends. Its members were aliens, beings who had existed for millions of years and who viewed humanity as, at best, a useful tool, and at worst, a cosmic threat. The possibility that the Cabal was using Alpharius Omegon, that their prophecy was either incomplete or deliberately misleading, cannot be dismissed. What we know for certain is that from the moment of their meeting with the Cabal, the Alpha Legion's loyalties became impossible to determine with any certainty. They sided with Horus publicly, participating in the great betrayal that would tear the Imperium apart. But their actions during the heresy were so contradictory, so seemingly random, that no coherent pattern could be discerned. Sometimes they fought against the Emperor's forces with deadly effectiveness. Other times they seemed to be actively undermining Horus's war effort from within. Were they loyal to Horus, loyal to the Emperor, loyal to the Cabal, or loyal only to themselves and whatever inscrutable plan they had devised in the wake of the Cabal's prophecy? The answer, as with everything else related to the Alpha Legion, depends entirely on which evidence you choose to believe and which you choose to dismiss. And that brings us to the heresy itself and the beginning of the end for the twin Primarchs. The Horus heresy was the defining catastrophe of the Imperium's history. It was a civil war of unimaginable scale and ferocity, pitting brother against brother, legion against legion, was in a conflict that would leave the Imperium shattered and the Emperor entombed on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. The war began with Horus's public declaration of rebellion and the massacre on Istvan III, where the War Master purged his own legions of loyalist elements in a betrayal of horrifying brutality. The Alpha Legion's involvement in the early stages of the heresy is difficult to track, which is, of course, exactly how Alpharius Omegon wanted it. They did not participate in the initial massacre at Istvan III, and their role at the subsequent drop site massacre on Istvan V is a matter of considerable debate. What is clear is that the Alpha Legion was present at Istvan V as part of the second wave of allegedly loyalist legions who turned on their brothers, helping to crush the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders in what was one of the most devastating ambushes in military history. But even at Istvan V, the Alpha Legion's behavior was not straightforward. Some accounts suggest that they were involved in operations that seemed designed to undermine Horus's forces, even as they nominally supported his cause. They got into a firefight with the Iron Warriors during the battle, an incident that makes no sense if the Alpha Legion was simply following Horus's orders. Were they pursuing their own agenda even in the midst of the War Master's greatest triumph? It seems likely, although proving it is, as always with the Alpha Legion, virtually impossible. In the months and years that followed the drop site massacre, the Alpha Legion spread out across the galaxy, pursuing objectives that seemed to have little to do with the main thrust of Horus's campaign. They appeared in dozens of war zones simultaneously, fighting on both sides of the conflict with apparent indifference to which faction they were nominally supporting. This behavior is consistent with the twin Primarchs operating independently, with Alpharius pursuing one set of objectives while Omegon pursued another, possibly in direct contradiction of his brother's goals. One of the most significant Alpha Legion operations during the heresy was the infiltration of the Raven Guard. Following the devastating losses suffered by the 19th Legion at Istvan V, the Raven Guard retreated to their homeworld of deliverance to rebuild. Their Primarch, Corvus Corax, had obtained from the Emperor himself a sample of pure, or undifferentiated Primarch gene stock, the raw genetic material from which all the Primarchs had been created. Using this material, Corax hoped to rapidly rebuild his shattered legion through an accelerated process of gene seed cultivation. The Alpha Legion, acting on intelligence provided by the Cabal, recognized the strategic significance of this gene stock. They inserted their own operatives into the Raven Guard, using surgically altered Alpha Legionaries disguised as Raven Guard survivors from Istvan V. These infiltrators spent months embedded within the 19th Legion, gathering intelligence and waiting for the right moment to strike. When the time came, the Alpha Legion agents sabotaged the Raven Guard's gene seed research, introducing corruption into the Primarch gene stock that produced horrifically mutated and unstable new marines, rather than the viable reinforcements Corax desperately needed. The resulting abominations had to be destroyed, setting back the Raven Guard's rebuilding efforts by years and leaving the 19th Legion critically under strength during a period when every available warrior was desperately needed. But here is where the story takes one of those characteristic Alpha Legion twists. Omegon personally recovered the corrupted gene stock data from the Raven Guard's laboratories. He was then obligated to share this information with Horus, who passed it along to the traitor apothecary Fabius Bile for further research. However, what Omegon actually gave Horus was incomplete data, practically useless for any serious genetic research. But the Alpha Legion kept the complete, uncontaminated version of the data for themselves, intending to use it to enhance their own legion at some future point. This single incident encapsulates everything about the Alpha Legion's approach to the heresy. They carried out a mission that appeared to serve Horus's interests, undermining a loyalist legion's ability to rebuild. But they did so in a way that also served their own independent agenda, securing valuable genetic material that they had no intention of sharing with the War Master. They were playing both sides, advancing their own goals while maintaining the appearance of loyal service to whichever faction they happened to be nominally supporting at the time. After this operation, Omegon took a remarkable step. He left the Cabal's representative, an alien being named Athithirtia, stranded aboard a ship in the void. His message was clear. The Alpha Legion would fulfill its commitment, but it would do so on its own terms, without further external interference or control. From that point forward, whatever the twins were doing, they were doing it for their own reasons, guided by their own interpretation of the Cabal's prophecy, rather than by the aliens' ongoing direction. The Alpha Legion's actions during the middle period of the heresy become increasingly complex and contradictory. They dispatched forces to blockade the White Scars in the Kondak system, preventing the 5th Legion from learning about Horus's betrayal and potentially joining the Loyalist cause. But within that very operation, Omegon apparently sent forces to destroy an Alpha Legion-controlled pylon array that was blocking the White Scars' communications. This act of apparent self-sabotage ensured that the White Scars would eventually learn the truth and side with the Emperor, which is exactly what happened when a message from Rogel Dawn reached the Khan. So which was it? Were the Alpha Legion trying to keep the White Scars ignorant and neutral as Horus had ordered? Or were they secretly ensuring that the Khan would learn the truth and join the Loyalist cause? The answer appears to be both, simultaneously. Different elements of the Alpha Legion were pursuing contradictory objectives, possibly under the separate direction of the two twin Primarchs. This brings up one of the most fascinating and troubling aspects of the Alpha Legion's role in the heresy. There is evidence to suggest that Alpharius and Omegon were not entirely in agreement about how to proceed. Some sources indicate that Alpharius was more willing to accept civilian casualties and more committed to ensuring Horus's victory, while Omegon was more cautious and more inclined to hedge his bets by maintaining channels of communication with the Loyalist side. If this is true, it means that the twin Primarchs, those two halves of a single soul, were pulling in different directions during the most critical period of the Imperium's history. It means that the Alpha Legion's seemingly contradictory behavior was not just the result of a deliberate strategy of confusion, but of genuine internal conflict between its two leaders. The one soul in two bodies was being torn apart by irreconcilable visions of the future, and the Legion itself was caught in the middle. This internal tension would reach its breaking point in one of the most pivotal moments of the entire heresy, a battle that would claim the life of one of the twin Primarchs and irrevocably alter the fate of the Alpha Legion. That battle took place in the most unlikely of locations, on the frozen moons of the most distant planet in the Sol system. It took place at Pluto. Before we move on to the Battle of Pluto itself, let me take a moment to discuss one of the most audacious operations the Alpha Legion conducted during the run-up to the Solar War, because it perfectly encapsulates everything that made the 20th Legion so remarkable and so terrifying. Deep within the Imperial Palace on Terra, there existed a chamber known as the Investuary, This was a vast, though solemn hall that contained statues representing each of the 20 Primarchs, a monument to the Emperor's greatest creations, and a reminder of the family that had once stood united before the heresy tore it apart. The Investuary was not just a museum or a memorial. It was a symbol, a physical representation of the bond between father and sons, between the Emperor and his creations. For the Loyalists defending Terra, the Investuary represented everything they were fighting for, the ideal of a united humanity led by the greatest beings ever produced by human genetic science. The Alpha Legion infiltrated the Investuary. Let that sink in for a moment. In the middle of the most heavily fortified location in the entire Imperium, as under the watchful eyes of the Legio Custodes and surrounded by layers of security that would have been considered impenetrable by any rational assessment, Alpha Legion operatives penetrated the Imperial Palace and entered one of its most sacred chambers. They moved through corridors that were patrolled by the deadliest warriors in the Imperium. They bypassed security measures that had been designed to stop anything from a lone assassin to a full-scale military invasion. And they did it all without being detected. Once inside the Investuary, the Alpha Legion operatives destroyed every statue in the chamber. Every single one, with 2 deliberate exceptions. They left standing the statue of Alpharius and the statue of Rogel Dawn. The message was unmistakable. By leaving only these 2 statues intact, and the Alpha Legion was issuing a direct challenge to the Praetorian of Terra. They were saying, in the most dramatic and insulting way possible, that the real war was between the 20th and 7th Legions, between the Master of Deception and the Master of Defense. Every other Primarch, every other Legion was irrelevant. The statues of Horus and Guilliman and Russ and all the others were rubble on the floor. Only Alpharius and Dawn remained standing, facing each other across the empty chamber like chess players contemplating the board before the final move. Rogel Dawn was furious, but more than that, he was unsettled. The infiltration of the Investuary demonstrated something that he had been reluctant to acknowledge, that the Alpha Legion could reach anywhere at any time, regardless of the defenses that were put in place. Now, if they could penetrate the Imperial Palace itself, they could penetrate anything. No fortress was truly secure. No stronghold was truly impregnable. The only thing standing between the Alpha Legion and any target they chose to attack was the 20th Legion's own willingness to take the risk. Dawn kept the desecration of the Investiary secret. He did not report it to Malcador the Sigillite. He did not inform the Legio Custodes. He sealed the chamber and dealt with the implications privately, adding the destruction of the statues to the long list of personal affronts that fueled his determination to confront and destroy the Alpha Legion. The fact that even Malcador, the Regent of Terra, and arguably the most well-informed individual in the Imperium after the Emperor himself, Mao was kept in the dark about the incident, speaks to both the severity of the security breach and Dawn's personal shame at having allowed it to happen. How did the Sigillite eventually discover what had happened? That remains a mystery. Malcador had his own intelligence networks, his own agents and informants, and his own psychic abilities, any of which could have revealed the truth to him. But the fact that Dawn was so determined to conceal the breach, and that Malcador nevertheless discovered it, tells us something important about the power dynamics within the Loyalist command structure during the final stages of the heresy. Even among allies, even among those fighting for the same cause, there were secrets within secrets, layers of trust and distrust that mirrored the very philosophy of the enemy they were fighting against. And the Investuary incident also reveals something important about the Alpha Legion's psychological approach to warfare. They did not just want to achieve military objectives. They wanted to get inside their enemy's head. The destruction of the statues was not a military operation in any conventional sense. It did not weaken Terra's defenses. It did not destroy critical infrastructure. It did not eliminate key personnel. What it did was far more insidious. It planted doubt. It made Rogel Dawn, the most steadfast and unshakable of all the Loyalist Primarchs, question the reliability of his own defenses. It made him wonder what else the Alpha Legion might have done inside the palace that he had not yet discovered. It made him look over his shoulder, though distracted from the larger strategic picture by the nagging awareness that his enemy could be anywhere, doing anything at any time. This is psychological warfare at its most refined, not the crude terror tactics of the Night Lords, who used violence and horror to break the enemy's will, not the overwhelming force of the Iron Warriors, who shattered defenses through sheer weight of firepower and bodies, but the quiet, persistent erosion of confidence that comes from knowing that your enemy is smarter than you, more patient than you, and more willing to play the long game. The Alpha Legion did not want to destroy the Imperial Fists. They wanted to make the Imperial Fists destroy themselves by second-guessing every decision, questioning every intelligence report, and trusting nothing and no one. Now, I want to explore in greater depth the nature of the psychic bond between the twin Primarchs, because this aspect of their existence is both the most fascinating and the least understood element of their story. We know that the Primarchs, as a group, possessed certain psychic abilities that varied widely in nature and intensity. Some, like Magnus the Red, were among the most powerful psykers in the galaxy. Others, like Rogel Dawn and Mortarion, appeared to have little or no psychic ability and were, in fact, resistant to psychic influence. The nature and extent of each Primarch's psychic capabilities were as individual as the Primarchs themselves, shaped by both their genetic design and the experiences of their upbringing. Alpharius and Omegon's psychic bond was something entirely unique among the Primarchs. It was not merely telepathy, but not simply the ability to send and receive thoughts across a distance. It was something deeper, something more fundamental, a connection that operated at the level of the soul itself. The twins described themselves as one soul in two bodies, and while this might sound like poetic exaggeration, the evidence suggests that it was a reasonably accurate description of their actual experience. The bond allowed the twins to share perceptions, to see through each other's eyes and hear through each other's ears across vast distances. It allowed them to coordinate their actions with a precision that defied normal communication, reacting to each other's movements and decisions as if they were two hands controlled by a single brain. And, most disturbingly, it may have allowed them to swap their consciousness between their bodies, literally trading places, so that Alpharius's mind inhabited Omegon's body and vice versa. This last ability, if it truly existed, has profound implications for our understanding of the twin Primarchs and for the question of who actually died at Pluto and Escrador. If the twins could swap consciousness, then the physical body that Rogel Dawn killed on Pluto's moon might have contained Omegon's mind rather than Alpharius's. Or it might have contained the mind of neither twin, if the ability extended to swapping with other beings entirely. The mind swap between Alpharius and Celsalonius that occurred during the Battle of Pluto suggests that this ability was not limited to the twin bond, but could be extended to other individuals as well. The implications of this for the twin Primarch's survival are obvious and deeply troubling. If Alpharius could place his consciousness in the body of a subordinate, then the being who died at Pluto might have been Alpharius's body, but not Alpharius's mind. The real Alpharius could have been somewhere else entirely, watching through borrowed eyes as Dawn cut down a shell that no longer contained its original occupant. This is speculation, of course, and it is impossible to verify. But with the Alpha Legion, the impossible has a disturbing tendency to turn out to be merely improbable. The severance of the twin bond following the death at Pluto is described in visceral, almost physical terms. Omegon did not simply receive news of his brother's death, he felt it. He experienced the tearing of a connection that had defined his entire existence. A psychic wound so profound that it caused something approaching a breakdown in a being who had been designed to be functionally indestructible. The fact that Omegon was so devastated by the severance of the bond is, paradoxically, the strongest evidence that the death at Pluto was genuine. A decoy death, a staged elimination using a body double or a mind-swapped subordinate would not have produced this reaction. only the actual severing of the soul bond would have affected Omegon so profoundly, or so one would think. But with the Alpha Legion, even grief could be a performance. Even the most private and personal of reactions could be part of a larger strategy, a demonstration designed to convince observers that the death was real, even if it was not. The possibility that Omegon's breakdown was itself a deception, as a carefully calibrated display of emotion designed to sell the narrative of Alpharius's death, cannot be entirely dismissed. It would be the most Alpha Legion thing imaginable, using the simulation of genuine human emotion as a tool of strategic deception. This is what makes discussing the twin Primarchs so exhausting and so fascinating in equal measure. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. Every seemingly definitive statement comes with an asterisk, a caveat, a "but what if?" The twins built their entire existence around the principle that nothing should ever be taken at face value, and they succeeded so thoroughly that 10,000 years later, we still cannot determine with any confidence what was real and what was performance. Let me also address the question of the Alpha Legion's relationship with chaos, as because this is an area where significant misunderstanding exists, and where the truth, insofar as it can be determined, is considerably more nuanced than most casual observers assume. The Alpha Legion is classified as a traitor legion. They sided with Horus during the heresy, they fought against loyalist forces, and they continue to operate as enemies of the Imperium in the current era. By any conventional measure, they are servants of chaos. But the reality is far more complicated. Unlike the other traitor legions, the Alpha Legion never dedicated themselves to any specific chaos god. The World Eaters belong to Khorne. The Thousand Sons serve Tzeentch. The Death Guard are pledged to Nurgle. The Emperor's children worship Slaanesh. As each of these legions has been fundamentally transformed by its relationship with a specific aspect of the warp, reshaped at the physical and spiritual level by the patronage of a dark deity. The Alpha Legion has no such relationship. They use chaos when it serves their purposes, just as they use every other tool available to them. Some individual warbands have pledged themselves to specific chaos gods, as we discussed earlier, with the Khornate First Strike warband. But the Legion as a whole maintains a studied independence from the ruinous powers. They are, in the words of one partially redacted quote attributed to the twin Primarchs themselves, uncertain allies to the Chaos Gods, a force that serves its own purposes rather than the purposes of any external power, mortal or divine. And this independence from chaos has practical implications. It means that the Alpha Legion's gene seed has remained relatively untainted by warp corruption, a significant advantage when it comes to maintaining the physical and mental capabilities of the Legion's warriors. It means that the Alpha Legion is not subject to the whims and demands of the Chaos Gods, who frequently interfere in the operations of the legions that serve them, redirecting resources and personnel to serve the gods' own inscrutable agendas. And it means that the Alpha Legion is trusted by neither side of the eternal conflict between the Imperium and Chaos, which is, from a certain perspective, exactly the position they want to be in. A force that is trusted by no one has no obligations to anyone. It can act in its own interests without fear of disappointing a patron or betraying an ally. It can change its apparent allegiance at will, fighting for the Imperium one day and against it the next, without the kind of spiritual consequences that would affect a legion that had genuinely pledged its soul to a chaos god. The Alpha Legion's refusal to commit to either side of the Imperium-Chaos divide is not a weakness. It is the ultimate expression of the twins' philosophy, that true freedom lies in being beholden to no one. There is a passage from a document known as the Codex Hydra, a suppressed work of what the Inquisition calls mimetic corrosion, that offers what may be the most insightful description of the Alpha Legion's self-perception ever committed to record. And the passage describes the 20th Legion as a necessary evil to the Imperium, acting as both its poison and antidote, in an unavoidable destiny that they have created for themselves and others. The Alpha Legion sees itself not as servants of chaos or champions of the Emperor, but as something entirely outside both categories, a force that exists to fulfill a purpose that transcends the binary conflict between order and annihilation. Whether this self-perception is accurate or delusional is, of course, another question entirely. The Alpha Legion has had 10,000 years to develop narratives about itself, to construct mythologies that justify its existence and romanticize its methods. The necessary evil framework could be a genuine expression of the Legion's core philosophy, or it could be yet another layer of self-deception, and a comforting story that the 20th Legion tells itself to avoid confronting the possibility that their Primarchs' grand strategy was nothing more than a catastrophic miscalculation based on the manipulations of self-interested aliens. But this uncertainty is itself instructive. It tells us something about the nature of identity and purpose in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, a universe where the line between hero and villain is rarely as clear as either side would like to believe. The Alpha Legion forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that loyalty and treachery are not absolute categories, but points on a spectrum, and that a being or an organization can occupy multiple positions on that spectrum simultaneously, depending on which of their actions you choose to examine and which you choose to ignore. In this sense, the twin Primarchs and their legions serve as a mirror for the Imperium itself. The Imperium also tells itself comforting stories about its own nature and purpose. It calls itself the defender of humanity, while grinding billions of its citizens into dust. It proclaims its devotion to the Emperor, while maintaining a theocratic tyranny that the Emperor himself would have despised. It fights against chaos, while employing methods that are, in many cases, indistinguishable from the methods of its enemies. The Imperium is not the heroic institution it claims to be, just as the Alpha Legion is not the simple enemy it is classified as. The difference is that the Alpha Legion knows it is playing a role. The Imperium, for the most part, does not. And in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, that self-awareness, as that willingness to see clearly and act accordingly even when the truth is painful and the choices are impossible, may be the closest thing to wisdom that anyone can achieve. The Battle of Pluto was the opening act of the Solar War, the final campaign of the Horus Heresy that would culminate in the Siege of Terra itself. As Horus's armada prepared for the final push toward the throne world, the War Master needed the Sol System's defenses to be weakened, its communications disrupted, its garrison forces thrown into confusion. And the Primarch he trusted to accomplish this task was Alpharius. The mission was pure Alpha Legion. It was not a straightforward military assault. It was a symphony of deception, infiltration, and misdirection operating on a scale that beggared belief. And it began with something that no one expected and no one could have predicted. It began with silence. Alpharius took his fleet, the great warship Alpha, leading a force of over 200 vessels, and pointed them toward the Sol System. Then, he powered down virtually every system on every ship, reducing heat signatures to the absolute minimum. He put himself and the entire crew into stasis, and then he waited as his fleet drifted through the void at minimal speed, unpowered and undetectable, slowly, inexorably closing the distance to Terra. It took an entire year. For 12 full months, the Alpha Legion fleet drifted through the darkness of space like a collection of dead hulks, giving off no energy signatures, transmitting no communications, showing no signs of life, as any sensor sweep that happened to pass over them would have registered nothing but inert metal. The approach was so slow, so patient, so utterly at odds with the urgency of the War Master's campaign that it bordered on the insane. But it worked. The Alpha Legion fleet arrived at the outskirts of the Sol System completely undetected, having bypassed every layer of the early warning network that Rogel Dawn had so carefully constructed. But the fleet was only one element of the plan. The real genius of the Alpha Legion's assault on the Sol System was what had already been put in place years before the heresy even began: sleeper cells. Alpha Legion operatives who had been planted throughout the Sol System during the years of the Great Crusade, hidden among the billions of ordinary humans who inhabited Terra, Mars, Luna, and the moons of the outer planets. These agents had been in place for years, living normal lives, maintaining their cover, waiting for the activation signal that would tell them it was time to act. When that signal came, the Sol system erupted into chaos. A freighter was detonated over Terra itself, raining debris across the planet's surface and killing millions of civilians. The Damocles starport, one of Terra's most critical orbital facilities, was devastated by sabotage. Rebellions erupted across the system, from the moons of the gas giants to the asteroid belt. Each of these incidents was designed to draw attention, to force Rogel Dawn and his Imperial fists to spread their forces thin across the entire system in an attempt to contain a dozen simultaneous crises. Because all of it, every bombing, every rebellion, and every act of sabotage, was a distraction. The real target was Pluto. Pluto sat at the outermost edge of the Sol system's defenses, and it was far more important than its small size suggested. The dwarf planet and its moons housed the primary astropathic monitoring stations for the entire system, the psychic early warning network that would detect the approach of Horus's main fleet and give Terra precious time to prepare. If Pluto fell, if its communications facilities were captured or destroyed, Terra would be blind. Horus's armada could approach without warning, arriving at the throne world before its defenders were prepared. Alpharius had identified this vulnerability and built his entire plan around exploiting it. While his sleeper cells created havoc across the system, drawing Dawn's attention in a dozen different directions, the Alpha Legion fleet emerged from its year-long drift and struck at Pluto and its moons with devastating force. But there was yet another layer to the deception, because with Alpharius, there was always another layer. The Primarch himself was not aboard his flagship. He had used a technique that was uniquely, disturbingly Alpha Legion. He had seemingly switched minds with one of his headhunter operatives, a captain named Kel Silonius. Alpharius's consciousness inhabited Silonius's body, while Silonius's mind was placed in the Primarch's form aboard the Alpha. The real Alpharius, wearing the body of a common captain, led a headhunter team directly onto Terra itself, infiltrating the heart of the Imperium's defenses, while everyone assumed the Primarch was safely commanding his fleet from a distance. This is the kind of thing that drove the Alpha Legion's enemies to despair. How do you defend against a commander who can literally be anyone, anywhere? How do you plan a counter-strategy when the opposing general might be wearing the face and body of one of his own subordinates? The answer is that you cannot, not unless you are Rogel Dawn. Dawn was many things. He was stubborn, inflexible, and frequently described as about as subtle as a sledgehammer. But he was also brilliant in ways that his detractors consistently underestimated. Where Alpharius was the master of deception, Dawn was the master of preparation. He might not be able to predict exactly what the Alpha Legion would do, but he could ensure that whatever they did, he would be ready for it. When the truth of the Alpha Legion's assault became clear, it's when Dawn realized that the diversionary attacks across the system were just that, diversions, and that Pluto was the real target, he acted with characteristic decisiveness. Using a brilliant gravitational slingshot maneuver around Sol's gravity wells, he catapulted his flagship, the massive star fortress known as the Phalanx, from the inner system to the outer edge at extraordinary speed, arriving at Pluto far faster than should have been physically possible. Dawn brought with him his personal guard, the legendary Huskal Terminators, warriors chosen from the finest the Imperial fists had to offer. Among them was Archimus, the commander of the Huskals and one of the most experienced and trusted warriors in the entire 7th Legion. Archimus had been tasked with hunting the Alpha Legion's infiltrators throughout the Sol system, and he had correctly deduced that Pluto was the Alpha Legion's true objective. What followed was a battle that was as much a contest of intellect as it was of arms. The Alpha Legion had captured several of Pluto's moons, and their forces were converging on Hydra, the moon that housed the astropathic monitoring station. Alpharius himself, still wearing Silonius's face, had somehow made his way to the contested moon, leading his headhunters in a spearhead assault aimed at silencing the astropathic choir and plunging Terra's intelligence network into darkness. And it nearly worked. The Alpha Legion's attack was precisely coordinated, hitting the defenders from multiple angles simultaneously, while sleeper agents within the facility activated to cause maximum confusion. Whilst the monitoring station's defenses were being overwhelmed when dawn arrived, the Praetorian of Terra teleported directly into the contested facility, his Huskal Terminators materializing in flashes of displaced air and crackling energy. The fighting was immediate and brutal, the close quarters of the facility negating many of the Alpha Legion's advantages in mobility and deception. In the confined corridors and armored chambers of the monitoring station, the battle devolved into the kind of straightforward, brutal, close combat that favored the Imperial Fist's strengths. And then, the two Primarchs came face to face. The duel between Rogel Dawn and Alpharius was not the elaborate, dramatic affair that some accounts might lead you to expect. It was fast, it was vicious, and it was surprisingly short. Alpharius wielded the Pale Spear, and a weapon of incredible power, a double-pronged spear of unknown origin that could punch through virtually any armor, and whose wounds were said to be impossible to heal. Dawn carried Storm's Teeth, the massive chainsword that had become synonymous with the Praetorian of Terra. The two brothers clashed with the full fury of their transhuman natures. Alpharius was fast and cunning, using every trick at his disposal to find an opening in Dawn's defenses. He struck with precision and guile, probing for weaknesses, looking for the gap that would allow the Pale Spear to deliver its killing blow. And for a time, it seemed as though he might succeed. But Dawn had something that Alpharius did not expect. He had patience, and he had the willingness to accept pain in exchange for victory. But when Alpharius launched what should have been the killing blow, driving the Pale Spear toward a gap in Dawn's armor, the Imperial Fist's Primarch did something that no one anticipated. He deliberately stepped into the strike. He allowed the spear to pierce his shoulder, accepting the agonizing wound in order to pin Alpharius in place. The spear was embedded in his flesh, and as long as Alpharius held onto it, he was trapped. Archamus, the Huskal commander, saw what was happening and attempted to intervene, throwing his combat blade at the spear's haft. The weapon bounced away harmlessly, but the distraction was enough. Dawn grabbed the spear with one hand, holding it in place through sheer force of will, and with the other, he brought Storm's Teeth screaming down. The great chainsword sliced through Alpharius's wrists, severing both hands from his arms. The Primarch staggered, his mouth moving wordlessly as the reality of what had just happened registered. Dawn did not hesitate. He slashed Alpharius across the chest with a backhand stroke, then stabbed his wounded brother with the Pale Spear itself, driving the Primarch's own weapon through his body. The final blow was delivered with brutal efficiency. Rogel Dawn brought Storm's Teeth around in a devastating overhead arc that cleaved through Alpharius's skull, splitting it from crown to chin. The Primarch of the Alpha Legion, the Master of Deception, the Lord of Serpents, died not at the end of an elaborate trap or a carefully orchestrated scheme, but at the hands of a brother who was simply better in a straight fight. There is a certain poetic justice in the manner of Alpharius's death. And he was a being who had spent his entire existence avoiding direct confrontation, who had built his legend on misdirection and the ability to be somewhere other than where his enemies expected. He was killed by a Primarch who represented everything he had always tried to avoid: directness, honesty, and the straightforward application of overwhelming force. Alpharius died because, for perhaps the only time in his life, he could not slip away. He could not hide. He could not deceive his way out of danger. He was pinned in place by a brother who was willing to sacrifice his own flesh to hold him there. The death of Alpharius sent shockwaves through the Alpha Legion. Celsalonius, who was commanding the fleet from aboard the Alpha, ordered an immediate withdrawal. The fleet retreated from Pluto, and abandoning the campaign and leaving the Sol system's outer defenses battered but intact. But Silonius's reaction to his Primarch's death was, characteristically, not what anyone expected. He seemed almost unconcerned, stating simply that all in the Legion were one. Whether this was genuine stoicism, a pre-planned response, or evidence that the being who died on Pluto's moon was not actually Alpharius at all, is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. In the aftermath of the battle, Dawn took steps to suppress all knowledge of what had occurred. He kept the details of Alpharius's death secret, even from Malcador the Sigillite and the Legio Custodes. The statues in the Investory, the great hall containing representations of all 20 Primarchs, had already been destroyed by Alpha Legion infiltrators, and all except two, Alpharius's own statue and Dawn's. Dawn saw this as both a challenge and a taunt, and he met it with characteristic directness by simply refusing to acknowledge it publicly. The Imperial Fists oversaw a massive purge of suspected Alpha Legion assets throughout the Sol system, hunting down and eliminating sleeper cells that had been embedded in the system's population for years. But even this effort was hampered by the fundamental nature of the Alpha Legion's operational structure. How do you identify an agent who has been living as an ordinary citizen for a decade? How do you find a sleeper who shows no signs of activation until the moment they strike? The answer is that you cannot, not completely, and the lingering threat of undiscovered Alpha Legion agents would continue to haunt the Sol system for years to come. But the truly devastating consequences of the Battle of Pluto were felt not in the Sol system, but far away, in the consciousness of a being who had just lost something that could never be replaced. Omegon felt his twin's death. The psychic bond between the two Primarchs, that connection that they had described as sharing a single soul, transmitted the moment of Alpharius's death across whatever distance separated them. Omegon experienced the severance of that bond as a trauma of almost incomprehensible magnitude. For the first time since their reunion on Bar Saver, he was truly alone. Half of his soul had been torn away, and the emptiness that replaced it was something that no amount of strategic brilliance or tactical cunning could fill. According to some accounts, Omegon suffered something approaching a breakdown in the immediate aftermath of his brother's death. He grew distant, withdrawing from those around him, consumed by a grief that he could not express, and that no one around him would have understood, even if he had tried. The secret of the twin Primarchs was still intact, still known only to the Alpha Legion itself. As far as the wider Imperium was concerned, Alpharius was dead, and the 20th Legion was leaderless. No one outside the Legion knew that there was a second Primarch waiting in the wings, and so Omegon did what he had to do. He took up his brother's name. He became Alpharius, not as a disguise or a temporary measure, but as a permanent assumption of an identity that was not his own. From the moment of the real Alpharius's death, Omegon stepped into his brother's role and played it so convincingly that the transition was seamless. The Alpha Legion continued to operate as if nothing had changed, because as far as the vast majority of its members were concerned, nothing had changed. Their Primarch was still Alpharius. He had always been Alpharius, and he always would be. But something fundamental had changed, even if only Omegon himself was fully aware of it. The twin Primarchs had been the Alpha Legion's greatest asset, their ability to be in two places at once, to lead from the front and the rear simultaneously, to switch identities with seamless efficiency. With Alpharius dead, that advantage was gone. Omegon was alone, and while he possessed all of his brother's skills and much of his strategic brilliance, he was working without a net for the first time in his existence. When Horus summoned the Alpha Legion to muster for the Siege of Terra, it was Omegon, wearing his dead brother's name, who appeared before the War Master. His actions at this point are deeply revealing. Rather than joining the assault on Terra, Omegon openly withdrew the Alpha Legion from the traitor war effort. He gave Horus a cylinder containing a detailed map of the Sol system's defenses, information that the Alpha Legion had extracted from their operations at Pluto and throughout the system, and then he left. He took his legion, and he walked away from the climactic battle of the heresy. What was he doing? What was the plan? Some sources suggest that Omegon had decided, in the wake of his brother's death, to reject the Cabal's prophecy entirely. Without Alpharius to share the burden of that terrible choice, Omegon may have concluded that the price of following the Cabal's path was too high, that the sacrifice of humanity was not a sacrifice he was willing to make on his own. The gift of the defensive data to Horus could be interpreted as a final gesture of compliance, a way of fulfilling the letter of their agreement with the traitors while withdrawing from any further participation in the war. Other sources suggest something different. They point to Omegon's actions in the aftermath of the siege, when the Alpha Legion did not join the other traitor legions in their retreat to the Eye of Terror. Instead, they moved eastward across the galaxy, pursuing objectives of their own devising. This was not the behavior of a broken and leaderless legion, as it was the behavior of a force that was operating according to a plan that none of the other players in the great game of the heresy were privy to. The Alpha Legion's eastward movement brought them into conflict with the Ultramarines, and specifically with Reboot Guilliman. Whether this confrontation was deliberate or coincidental is unknown, but given the Alpha Legion's history, coincidence seems unlikely. The Alpha Legion and the Ultramarines had unfinished business, a rivalry that stretched back to the days of the Great Crusade, and it seems probable that the meeting at Escrador was, at some level, planned. The Battle of Escrador is one of the most significant and most debated engagements in post-heresy history. It was the last recorded battle between a Primarch of the Alpha Legion and one of his loyalist brothers, and its outcome would determine the fate of the 20th Legion for the next 10,000 years. The being who commanded the Alpha Legion at Escrador was going by the name Alpharius, as had been the case since the real Alpharius died at Pluto. Whether this was Omegon or someone else entirely is a question we will address shortly. For now, let us simply call him the Alpha Legion's Primarch and examine what happened. The Primarch of the Alpha Legion was reportedly pleased when the Ultramarines arrived. He saw the confrontation as an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of his legion's flexible, adaptable methods against Guilliman's rigid, doctrine-driven approach. The Alpha Legion had spent its entire existence preparing for exactly this kind of challenge, and its Primarch was confident that his strategies would prove superior to the predictable, methodical approach that Guilliman was known for. It was a fatal miscalculation. Guilliman proved himself the greatest of strategists at Escrador, not by being more clever than his opponent, but by being less predictable. He recognized that the Alpha Legion would try to anticipate his tactics based on his established doctrines. They would study the Codex, analyze his past campaigns, and predict his movements based on the patterns that had been documented and catalogued over centuries of warfare. And then they would position their forces to exploit those predictions. So Guilliman did something completely out of character. He abandoned his own doctrines. Instead of the methodical, the systematic approach that every intelligence assessment would have predicted, Guilliman launched a sudden, surgical strike at the Alpha Legion's command center, leading his most elite warriors in a rapid assault that bypassed the outer defenses entirely and struck directly at the heart of the enemy's command structure. The Alpha Legion was caught completely off guard. Their entire defensive strategy had been built around the assumption that Guilliman would follow his own rules, that he would advance methodically and predictably, giving them time and space to execute their counter-strategies. When he instead showed up at their doorstep with a hand-picked force of killers, the elaborate plans fell apart. The two Primarchs met in single combat, and the outcome was decisive. Guilliman killed the being who called himself Alpharius. Whether this was truly Omegon, the last remaining twin Primarch, or some other individual who had assumed the role, is a question that has never been definitively answered. The Ultramarines themselves were not entirely convinced that they had killed the real Primarch, and the uncertainty surrounding this event has persisted for 10 millennia. What happened next, however, is far more revealing than the outcome of the duel itself. Guilliman expected the Alpha Legion to collapse. Every other legion in history had been devastated by the loss of its Primarch. The psychological and spiritual bond between a Primarch and his legion was so deep, so fundamental, that the death of the Primarch typically shattered the legion's cohesion and morale. The Alpha Legion did not collapse. It did not break. It did not flee. Instead, it attacked. While the remaining Alpha Legion forces turned on Guilliman's strike force with a fury and coordination that took the Ultramarines completely by surprise. For an entire week, the Alpha Legion fought the Ultramarines to a standstill, inflicting such heavy casualties that Guilliman was forced to order his forces to withdraw and regroup with the main body of the Ultramarine army. Even after losing their Primarch, the Alpha Legion had fought one of the greatest legions in the Imperium to a bloody draw and forced them off the field. This was not the behavior of a legion that had just suffered a decapitation strike. This was a legion that had been designed from the ground up to function without centralized leadership. Every Alpha Legionary had been trained to operate independently, was to make decisions and take action based on their own judgment, rather than waiting for orders from above. The Alpha Legion's organizational structure, with its emphasis on initiative and flexibility, meant that the loss of the Primarch, while devastating on a personal level, did not cripple the Legion's ability to fight. In the end, Guilliman gave up hope of achieving a decisive victory through ground combat. He ordered his forces to evacuate the planet and then subjected Escrador to a massive orbital bombardment, the blunt instrument of planetary destruction employed when no other option remained. The Alpha Legion survivors, if any remained, were left to fend for themselves on a world being reduced to rubble from orbit. The Battle of Escrador marked the end of the Alpha Legion as a unified fighting force. But it was also, in a very real sense, the beginning of something new, because the Alpha Legion did not die at Escrador. It scattered, it fragmented, it went to ground, dispersing into the galaxy in 1,000 different directions, each warband operating independently, each following its own interpretation of whatever orders had been left by the twin Primarchs. And here is the thing that makes the aftermath of Escrador so fascinating and so deeply unsettling. Despite being scattered across the galaxy, despite having no Primarch to guide them, despite being cut off from each other and from any central command authority, the Alpha Legion continued to operate with a degree of coordination and purpose that no other traitor legion could match. Their methods evolved, their targets shifted, but the fundamental character of the 20th Legion remained intact. As they were still the masters of deception, still the practitioners of shadow warfare, still the serpent that struck from 100 hidden places simultaneously. How? How did a leaderless, fragmented legion maintain such cohesion across 10,000 years and 1,000,000 light-years? The standard answer is that the Alpha Legion's training and organizational structure made it possible, that each warband carried within it the knowledge and the skills to operate independently while still pursuing the broader objectives of the Legion as a whole. And there is truth to that answer as far as it goes. But there is another possibility, a more disturbing possibility that has haunted the Inquisition and the Imperium's intelligence services for millennia. The possibility that the Alpha Legion is not leaderless at all. The possibility that one of the twin Primarchs, Alpharius or Omegon, or both, is still alive, still directing the Legion from the shadows, still pulling strings that no one else can see. Is it possible? Consider the evidence. The being killed at Pluto was confirmed as a Primarch through multiple independent sources, and Omegon's psychic reaction to the death suggests that it was genuine. But with Alpharius, nothing is ever truly confirmed. The Primarch's unique ability to disguise himself as an ordinary legionary, combined with the Alpha Legion's mastery of surgical alteration and identity theft, means that the being Dawn killed might have been someone else entirely, a champion or a captain who had been enhanced or altered to appear as a Primarch. Similarly, the death at Escrador is far from certain. The Ultramarines themselves were not convinced that they had killed the real Primarch. Some members of the Alpha Legion believe it was Omegon who died at Escrador. Others believe he survived, that the being Guilliman killed was a proxy or a double. The truth, as always with the Alpha Legion, is buried beneath so many layers of deception that extracting it may be simply impossible. What we do know is that in the 10 millennia since the heresy, the Primarch of the Alpha Legion has not been publicly seen or confirmed alive. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when dealing with a being whose entire existence was dedicated to remaining hidden. If any Primarch could survive for 10,000 years without being detected, it would be Alpharius or Omegon. They were designed for exactly this kind of endurance. Yeah, this kind of patient, long-term concealment. And so the mystery persists. The question that opened this account, who is Alpharius, remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, and that, in the end, may be the greatest victory the twin Primarchs ever achieved. Let us now turn our attention to the far future, to the 41st and 42nd millennia, and examine what became of the Alpha Legion in the 10,000 years following the heresy. Because the story of Alpharius Omegon does not end with the deaths, real or alleged, of the twin Primarchs. In many ways, it is only beginning. The Alpha Legion occupies a unique position among the traitor legions of the 40th and 41st millennia. While the other legions that turned against the Emperor largely retreated into the Eye of Terror, but that vast wound in reality where the warp bleeds into the material universe, the Alpha Legion did not. They scattered across the galaxy, yes, but they scattered into Imperial space, not away from it. They established hidden bases in asteroid fields, on derelict space hulks, on barren and unpopulated worlds, at the edges of Imperial civilization. They burrowed into the fabric of the Imperium itself like parasites, setting up networks of agents and sleeper cells that would persist for centuries, sometimes millennia. This decision to remain within Imperial space, rather than retreating to the Eye of Terror, had profound consequences for the Legion's development. Most importantly, it meant that the Alpha Legion was largely spared the worst effects of chaos corruption. The other traitor legions, living within the Eye of Terror where the warp's influence was constant and overwhelming, underwent horrifying mutations and transformations. Their bodies were twisted by the energies of chaos, their minds warped by the constant exposure to the whispers of dark gods. Many lost their humanity entirely, becoming something unrecognizable as the Space Marines they had once been. The Alpha Legion, by contrast, maintained a remarkable degree of physical and mental integrity. Their gene seed remained relatively pure, their bodies relatively untwisted by chaos mutation. Some Alpha Legionaries did succumb to corruption over the millennia, developing mutations and warp-tainted characteristics, but these cases were the exception rather than the rule. The 20th Legion's decision to operate in the material universe, away from the corrupting influence of the Eye, preserved them in a way that their traitorous brothers could only envy. But this physical purity masked a deeper and more troubling form of corruption. Not the corruption of the body, but the corruption of purpose. Because over 10,000 years, without a Primarch to provide direction, without a clear mission or objective, the Alpha Legion splintered not just organizationally, but ideologically. Different warbands developed different interpretations of the Legion's purpose, different understandings of what Alpharius and Omegon would have wanted, different visions of the future. The diversity of beliefs within the modern Alpha Legion is staggering. Some warbands remain genuinely loyal to the Emperor, as convinced that the twin Primarchs' decision to side with Horus was part of a long-term strategy to ultimately serve the Imperium. These loyalist warbands conduct covert operations against the forces of chaos, sabotaging enemy operations and providing intelligence to Imperial forces through channels so indirect and convoluted that the recipients rarely know where the information is coming from. One such warband, known as the Penitent Sons, is openly loyalist and so racked with guilt over the Legion's traitorous history that their members wear spikes on the inside of their helmets as a form of perpetual penance. They punish themselves for the sins of their forebears, while simultaneously fighting to atone for those sins through service to the Emperor they once betrayed. Other warbands have gone in the opposite direction entirely. The First Strike, for example, is a warband that has fully embraced the worship of Khorne, the blood god, one of the four major chaos powers. Their members bear the skulls and symbols of Khorne's devotees, and they hunger for close combat with a fervor that would make a World Eater nod in approval. But even in their devotion to Khorne, they retain something of the Alpha Legion's strategic sensibility. They do not simply charge blindly into battle. They seek out the most strategically significant point on the battlefield and then apply their violence there, using Khorne's fury as a precision instrument rather than a blunt weapon. Between these extremes lies a vast spectrum of beliefs, motivations, and allegiances. Some warbands serve chaos out of genuine conviction. Others use chaos as a tool, a drawing upon its power when it serves their purposes and discarding it when it does not. Some pursue personal agendas, fighting for the survival and advancement of their own warband above all other considerations. Others claim to be following the original vision of the twin Primarchs, whatever they interpret that vision to be. The Harrowmaster Solomon Akura stands out as perhaps the most significant Alpha Legion figure of the modern era. In the 42nd Millennium, Akura managed to do something that many believed impossible. He assembled a significant coalition of disparate Alpha Legion warbands into a unified force known as the Ghost Legion. This coalition included his own warband, the Serpent's Teeth, along with the Guns of Freedom, Shrouded Hand, Penitent Sons, the Faceless, Sons of Venom, First Strike, and Rustbloods. At the fact that Akura was able to bring together warbands as ideologically diverse as the Loyalist Penitent Sons and the Khornite First Strike speaks volumes about either his personal charisma or the continued existence of some deeper unifying principle within the Legion. Of particular significance is that Akura possesses the Pale Spear, the ancient weapon that once belonged to Alpharius himself. How this weapon came into Akura's possession is unclear, but its presence among the Serpent's Teeth carries enormous symbolic weight. The Pale Spear is the most iconic artifact of the twin Primarchs, the weapon that Alpharius wielded against Rogel Dawn in that fateful duel on Pluto's moon. For Akura to possess it suggests a direct line of succession from the Primarchs themselves, a continuity of leadership that extends back 10,000 years. All the Alpha Legion's operations in the current era continue to follow the patterns established during the Great Crusade and the Heresy. They use infiltration, sabotage, and subversion to destabilize their targets long before any overt military action is taken. They maintain networks of human agents, known as cultists in Imperial parlance, who operate throughout the Imperium. These agents are drawn from every level of Imperial society, from the lowest underhive gangers to the highest ranks of the planetary nobility. Some know they serve the Alpha Legion. Others have no idea that the organization they are working for has any connection to the traitor legions at all. The Alpha Legion's use of chaos cults is particularly noteworthy. While other traitor legions rely on chaos cults primarily as disposable cannon fodder, as the Alpha Legion uses them as instruments of strategic disruption. A well-placed chaos cult, carefully cultivated over years or decades, can destabilize an entire planet without a single Alpha Legionary ever setting foot on the surface. The cult creates chaos. The chaos draws the attention and resources of the local Imperial authorities. And while everyone is looking at the cult, the Alpha Legion pursues its real objectives completely unobserved. This approach makes the Alpha Legion extraordinarily difficult to combat. The Inquisition, the Imperium's primary internal security agency, has spent millennia trying to root out Alpha Legion cells and networks, with limited success. For every cell that is discovered and destroyed, a dozen more remain hidden, their activities undetected, their members indistinguishable from the ordinary citizens among whom they live. The Alpha Legion has achieved something that even the most zealous Inquisitor has to grudgingly acknowledge as impressive. They have made themselves functionally invisible within the Imperium's own population. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Alpha Legion's modern operations is the ambiguity of their intentions. There are documented cases of Alpha Legion warbands conducting operations that appear to benefit the Imperium. sabotage missions against Chaos forces, intelligence provided to Imperial commanders through anonymous channels, strategic interventions that tipped the balance of critical battles in the Imperium's favor. These incidents are not isolated anomalies, they form a pattern. One that suggests at least some elements of the Alpha Legion are working toward goals that align, at least partially, with the Imperium's interests. But there are equally documented cases of Alpha Legion warbands working against the Imperium with deadly effectiveness. Planetary rebellions fomented by Alpha Legion agents, Imperial supply lines severed by Alpha Legion sabotage, key Imperial leaders assassinated by Alpha Legion operatives. These incidents are just as real and just as significant as the pro-Imperial ones. So which is the real Alpha Legion? The loyalists working from within to protect the Imperium, or the traitors seeking to tear it down from the inside? The answer, maddening as it may be, is probably both. Different warbands pursue different objectives based on their own interpretations of the twin Primarchs' legacy. There is no unified strategy, no master plan that governs all Alpha Legion operations. There is only the Hydra, a beast with 100 heads, each one acting independently, but all of them serving, in their own way, the collective will of the organism. And this brings us to what may be the most important and most deeply debated question in all of Alpha Legion lore. The question that has haunted the Inquisition, the High Lords of Terror, and every Imperial scholar who has ever tried to understand the 20th Legion. Is one of the twin Primarchs still alive? The evidence, such as it is, cuts both ways. On one hand, we have the confirmed death of Alpharius at the Battle of Pluto, an event witnessed by Rogel Dawn himself and corroborated by Omegon's psychic reaction to his twin's death. As we have the reported death of the being who called himself Alpharius at Escrador, killed in single combat by Robut Guilliman. If both of these accounts are taken at face value, then both twin Primarchs are dead and the Alpha Legion has been operating without a Primarch for 10,000 years. But nothing about the Alpha Legion should ever be taken at face value. Consider the following. The Alpha Legion's entire culture was built around the concept of identity substitution. Every legionary was trained to claim the identity of Alpharius. The Legion possessed advanced surgical techniques that could alter the physical appearance of its members. In at least one documented case, the real Alpharius switched consciousness with one of his subordinates, inhabiting a different body entirely. If the twins had the ability to swap minds with their legionaries, how can we be certain that the beings who died at Pluto and Escrador were actually the Primarchs themselves? Consider also the Alpha Legion's continued operational coherence. 10,000 years without a Primarch should have resulted in complete fragmentation and dissolution. Other legions that lost their Primarchs experienced severe disruption, even with the benefit of centralized organization and clear chains of command. The Alpha Legion, despite being the most decentralized and fragmented of all the traitor legions, has maintained a level of coordination that seems impossible without some form of unifying leadership. Could that leadership be a surviving Primarch? It is possible. The disappearance of both of the Alpha Legion's massive Gloriana-class battleships, the Alpha and the Beta, adds another layer of mystery. These were among the largest warships in the Imperium's arsenal, and they simply vanished without a trace in the aftermath of the heresy. No one has seen them since. No one knows where they are. For vessels of that size and symbolic significance to disappear so completely suggests a level of operational security that goes beyond what even the Alpha Legion's normal standards of secrecy would require. At some point after the heresy, reports reached the High Lords of Terror about a Chaos Lord claiming to be Alpharius, who was ravaging the moons of the Denevra subsector. This could have been just another case of an Alpha Legionary assuming the Primarch's identity, as was common practice within the 20th Legion, or it could have been something more. There is one more piece of evidence to consider, one that is more philosophical than factual, but no less significant for that. The Alpha Legion's maxim, "I am Alpharius," was not just a tool of deception, it was a statement of belief. Every Alpha Legionary carried within them a piece of their Primarch's purpose and will. In a very real sense, Alpharius lived on in every member of his legion, his strategies replicated in the independent decision-making of 10,000 warriors scattered across the galaxy. So perhaps the question, is Alpharius alive, is the wrong question. Perhaps the right question is, does it matter? The Alpha Legion functions. It adapts. It survives. It pursues objectives that seem to serve some larger purpose, even if that purpose is incomprehensible to outsiders. Whether a Primarch is directing operations from the shadows, or whether the Legion has simply become so thoroughly indoctrinated in its Primarch's methods that it no longer needs direct leadership, the end result is the same. The Hydra endures. Cut off one head, and two more take its place. And now, as we approach the end of this account, let us step back and consider the broader significance of Alpharius Omegon's story. Because beyond the specific events and battles and conspiracies, there is a deeper theme running through the tale of the twin Primarchs that speaks to some of the most fundamental questions of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The story of Alpharius Omegon is, at its core, a story about the nature of truth in a universe where truth is the scarcest resource of all. In the grim darkness of the far future, information is as valuable as ammunition and as dangerous as a virus. The side that controls the narrative, that shapes the understanding of events, that determines what is known and what is hidden, possesses a power that transcends mere military force. Alpharius understood this better than any of his brothers. He understood that the truth is not an absolute, not a fixed point that can be identified and relied upon, but a weapon that can be shaped and deployed like any other. This understanding is what makes the Alpha Legion so terrifying, not just to their enemies, but to their allies as well. You can fight a conventional enemy, you can defend against a military assault, you can even resist the corrupting influence of chaos through faith and willpower. But how do you fight an enemy who controls what you know? And how do you defend against deception when you cannot even determine what is true and what is false? How do you resist manipulation when the manipulator has been shaping your perceptions for years or decades without your knowledge? The answer, according to the Alpha Legion, is that you cannot. The only defense against deception is greater deception, and the only victory in a war of information is the one achieved by the side that tells the most convincing lies. It is a bleak and cynical philosophy, one that stands in stark contrast to the idealism that originally animated the Great Crusade. But it is also, in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, an uncomfortably accurate one. The twin Primarchs also embody one of the setting's most persistent and most troubling themes, the question of loyalty. In a universe where allegiance is measured in blood and betrayal is punished with extinction, the Alpha Legion exists in a permanent state of ambiguity. Are they loyal? To whom? By whose definition? The twins sided with Horus, but they may have done so out of loyalty to the Emperor. They fought against the Imperium, but they may have been fighting for humanity's ultimate survival. They embraced treachery, but their treachery may have been the most selfless act in human history. This ambiguity is not a bug in the Alpha Legion's narrative. It is the feature. It is the central tension that makes the 20th Legion so compelling and so endlessly debatable. Every other traitor legion has a relatively clear motivation for its betrayal. Horus was corrupted by chaos. The World Eaters were enslaved by their own rage. The Thousand Suns were driven by the need to protect their psychic abilities. The Death Guard were broken by disease and despair. Each of these stories is tragic, but each is ultimately comprehensible. You can understand why they turned, even if you condemn them for it. The Alpha Legion is different. You cannot understand why they turned, because you do not know why they turned. You do not know if they turned at all. The entire question of their loyalty remains open, and it will likely remain open forever, because that is how the twin Primarchs designed it. Certainty is the enemy of the Alpha Legion, and they have spent 10,000 years ensuring that certainty about their motives, their allegiances, and their ultimate objectives remains permanently out of reach. But there is one final aspect of the Alpha Legion's story that deserves attention, and that is the relationship between the twins themselves. Alpharius and Omegon are described as one soul in two bodies, a connection so deep that it transcended the physical separation of their individual forms. But even within that unity, there were differences. Subtle ones perhaps, but differences nonetheless. Alpharius, the public face of the Legion, appears to have been the more aggressive of the two, the more willing to accept casualties in pursuit of his objectives, the more committed to the Cabal's vision of using Horus's rebellion to ultimately destroy chaos. Omegon, the hidden twin, seems to have been more cautious, more concerned about the human cost of their schemes, more inclined to maintain connections with the loyalist side of the conflict. But this internal tension, this gentle pulling in different directions by two halves of what was supposed to be a single whole, adds a layer of tragedy to the twin Primarchs story that is often overlooked. They were not simply a two-headed general commanding a single army. They were two individuals with their own perspectives, their own moral compasses, their own interpretations of the impossible choice they had been asked to make. And when they could not agree, when the strain of the heresy and the weight of the Cabal's prophecy pulled them in different directions, the one soul that they shared was subjected to a stress that it was never designed to endure. The death of Alpharius at Pluto was not just the loss of a military commander. It was the severing of a bond that had defined Omegon's entire existence, and it was the removal of half of a partnership that had been designed to be permanent, an amputation of the soul that left Omegon fundamentally diminished. Whatever he did after that point, whatever decisions he made, and whatever plans he pursued, he was doing it alone for the first time in his life. And for a being who had been created as half of a pair, being alone was a form of suffering that no external enemy could inflict. This is the tragedy of the twin Primarchs, not the grand, dramatic tragedy of Horus's fall or the Emperor's entombment on the Golden Throne, but a smaller, quieter tragedy of separation and loss. Two beings who were meant to be one, torn apart by a war that they may or may not have helped to start, each one carrying forward a burden that was meant to be shared but could no longer be divided. One died at the hands of a brother who should have been an ally. The other disappeared into the shadows, carrying the weight of two identities and a prophecy that may have been nothing more than an alien manipulation. And somewhere in the vast darkness of the galaxy, 10,000 years later, the question still echoes. Who is Alpharius? Perhaps the answer is everyone. Perhaps it is no one. Perhaps the twins achieved, in their strange and terrible way, a form of immortality that none of their brothers could match. Not immortality of the body, but immortality of the idea. As long as the Alpha Legion endures, as long as legionaries whisper, "I am Alpharius," and enemies glance nervously over their shoulders, wondering who among them might be an agent of the 20th, the twin Primarchs live on. Their bodies may be dust and memory, but their legacy, their methods, their vision of warfare as an art of deception and misdirection survives in every operation, every infiltration, every whispered rumor of their return. In the end, that may be the most Alpha Legion outcome imaginable. Not a glorious last stand, not a dramatic resurrection, not a definitive answer to the questions that have plagued the Imperium for 10 millennia, but something more subtle, more enduring, and far more unsettling. The eternal uncertainty, the permanent question mark, the knowledge that somewhere out there, in the shadows between the stars, something is watching, something is planning, something is waiting. Hydra Dominatus. And on that note, that brings us to the end of tonight's deep dive into the most mysterious, most debated, and most endlessly fascinating of all the Primarchs. The story of Alpharius Omegon is a story that resists conclusions, that refuses to be neatly wrapped up and put away on a shelf. Every time you think you have found solid ground, the ground shifts beneath your feet, and you realize that what you thought was certainty was just another layer of the deception. But that is what makes the Alpha Legion so compelling. In a universe where most factions wear their motivations on their sleeve, where the lines between hero and villain are usually drawn in bold, bright colors, the Alpha Legion exists in a permanent state of grey. They are the question that will never be answered, the riddle that will never be solved, the shadow that will never be fully illuminated. And for those of us who love the lore of Warhammer 40,000, that makes them absolutely irresistible. The Alpha Legion was dispatched to blockade the White Scars, preventing them from leaving the Kondak system and joining the Loyalist forces gathering around Terra. This was a straightforward assignment, the kind of thing that any competent military force could have accomplished. But the Alpha Legion, being the Alpha Legion, turned it into something far more complex and far more revealing. On the surface, the Alpha Legion followed Horus's orders. They deployed a substantial fleet around the Kondak system, establishing a cordon that would prevent the White Scars from departing. They jammed astropathic communications in the region, using an array of Xenos constructs, similar to the Cadian pylons, to close off warp activity and ensure that no psychic messages could reach or leave the system. And the White Scars were effectively cut off from the wider galaxy, unaware that the Imperium was tearing itself apart around them. But then Omegon did something that directly contradicted the mission he had been assigned. He sent forces to destroy the very pylon array that was blocking the White Scars' communications. Not enemy forces, his own forces. Alpha Legion Marines attacked an Alpha Legion-controlled facility and destroyed the devices that were central to the Alpha Legion's own mission. The result was that the communication blackout was lifted, and the White Scars were able to receive a message from Rogel Dawn on Terra, a message that informed the Khan of Horus's betrayal and the civil war that was engulfing the Imperium. Armed with this knowledge, the Khan made the decision to side with the Emperor, eventually breaking through the Alpha Legion's blockade and racing toward Terra to join the defense of the throne world. So what was happening here? Was the Alpha Legion trying to keep the White Scars ignorant, as Horus had ordered? Or were they trying to ensure that the Khan learned the truth and chose the Loyalist side? The answer, maddeningly, appears to be both. The Alpha Legion blockaded the White Scars with one hand, while opening the door for their escape with the other. They obeyed Horus's orders in letter, while violating them in spirit. They gave the appearance of loyal service to the traitor cause, while secretly working to strengthen the Loyalist position. This is the behavior of a force that is not truly committed to either side of the conflict. It is the behavior of a force that is pursuing its own agenda. An agenda that sometimes aligns with Horus's interests and sometimes aligns with the Emperor's, but is ultimately independent of both. The Alpha Legion was not fighting for Horus. They were not fighting for the Emperor. They were fighting for whatever outcome they believed would best serve the objectives established by the Cabal's prophecy, and they were willing to take actions on both sides of the war in pursuit of that outcome. The White Scars incident also provides evidence for the theory that Alpharius and Omegon were not always in agreement about how to proceed. The blockade itself, the overt act of obedience to Horus's orders, bears the hallmarks of Alpharius's approach. The sabotage of the pylon array, the covert act that benefited the Loyalists, seems more consistent with Omegon's reported tendency toward caution and his inclination to maintain options on both sides of the conflict. If the twins were indeed pursuing contradictory strategies simultaneously, it would explain the apparent incoherence of the Alpha Legion's actions during this period. Let me now turn to another significant engagement that further illustrates the Alpha Legion's role during the heresy: the Battle of the Alaxes, Nebula, against the Space Wolves. The Space Wolves, the 6th Legion under their Primarch, Leman Russ, had been engaged in their own operations during the early stages of the heresy. Russ had led his legion in the burning of Prospero, the devastating assault on the Thousand Suns homeworld that had been ordered by the Emperor himself in response to Magnus the Red's violation of the Edict of Nicaea. In following the destruction of Prospero, the Space Wolves found themselves isolated and vulnerable, their forces scattered and their fleet damaged from the campaign. The Alpha Legion identified this vulnerability and struck. A large Alpha Legion fleet ambushed the Space Wolves in the Alaxis Nebula, trapping the 6th Legion in a pocket of space where the nebula's interference with sensors and communications played to the Alpha Legion's strengths. The battle that followed was intense and prolonged, with the Alpha Legion using the nebula's concealment to launch hit-and-run attacks on the Space Wolves fleet, while avoiding the kind of direct, decisive engagement that might favor the more combat-oriented 6th Legion. During the height of the battle, a contingent of elite Lernaean Terminators teleported aboard the bridge of the Hrafnkel, a Leman Russ's flagship. In the confusion of the boarding action, a being that appeared to be Alpharius, disguised as one of his own Lernaean Terminators, battled the Wolf King himself. The engagement was fierce but inconclusive, as events overtook the boarding action before a decisive outcome could be reached. Just when it seemed that the Space Wolves were on the verge of destruction, rescue arrived from an unexpected quarter. A large Dark Angels fleet, led by a mobile Ramillies-class starfort known as the Chimera, had detected the Space Wolves' distress signals and determined that the 6th Legion was still loyal to the Emperor. The arrival of the Dark Angels, the 1st Legion and one of the most powerful military forces in the Imperium, forced the Alpha Legion to withdraw. This engagement is significant for several reasons. First, and it demonstrates the Alpha Legion's willingness to engage even the most formidable opponents when they believed they had the tactical advantage. The Space Wolves were one of the most feared fighting forces in the Imperium, and yet the Alpha Legion attacked them without hesitation when circumstances favored their approach. Second, the attempted decapitation strike against Leman Russ, using Alpharius himself, or someone disguised as Alpharius, to lead the boarding action, shows the twin Primarchs' personal willingness to take risks when the potential reward justified it. And third, the battle's inconclusive outcome illustrates one of the Alpha Legion's fundamental limitations. Their methods were optimized for ambush and attrition, not for the kind of stand-up, slug-it-out battles that other legions specialized in. When the Dark Angels arrived and the tactical equation shifted against them, the Alpha Legion had no choice but to withdraw. There is another Alpha Legion action during the Heresy that deserves mention, even though it is less well documented than the operations we have already discussed. Members of the Shattered Legions, the survivors of the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders who had been devastated at Istvan V, formed guerrilla forces that conducted raids and ambushes against the traitors throughout the Heresy. One of the most prominent of these guerrilla commanders was Shadrach Meduson, an Iron Hands warrior who organized mixed forces from the 3 Shattered Legions into effective fighting units. And Alpharius is recorded as having manipulated Meduson's forces into attacking and destroying a cell of seemingly loyalist Alpha Legionaries. This is a remarkable piece of information because it suggests that there were indeed loyalist elements within the Alpha Legion itself, Marines who were genuinely fighting for the Emperor and against Horus, and that Alpharius was willing to use loyalist forces to eliminate these loyalist Alpha Legionaries. Why would Alpharius do this? If he was genuinely committed to the Cabal's plan and believed that Horus needed to win the war, then loyalist Alpha Legionaries represented a threat to that plan, a faction within his own legion that might interfere with his strategy by fighting too effectively for the Emperor's side. By manipulating Meduson into destroying these loyalists, Alpharius was eliminating a potential obstacle to his larger plan while keeping his own hands clean. But there is another possibility, one that is more disturbing and more quintessentially Alpha Legion. Perhaps the loyalist cell was a deliberate creation, a group of Alpha Legionaries who had been instructed to fight for the Emperor in order to establish credibility with the loyalists. By then arranging for their destruction at Meduson's hands, Alpharius could have been eliminating a cell that had served its purpose while simultaneously strengthening Meduson's reputation and capability, making the guerrilla commander a more effective thorn in Horus's side. If this interpretation is correct, it means that Alpharius was simultaneously weakening his own legion and strengthening the loyalist guerrilla forces that opposed the traitors. What it means he was working against his supposed allies, even as he appeared to be supporting them. and it means that no one, not even the Alpha Legionaries themselves, could be entirely certain which side their Primarch was actually on. This is the fundamental horror of the Alpha Legion, a horror that goes beyond physical violence or military destruction. It is the horror of not knowing, of being unable to trust, of living in a universe where the person standing next to you might be your closest ally or your deadliest enemy, and you have absolutely no way of telling the difference. The Alpha Legion did not just fight wars, they destroyed the basic human capacity for trust, the fundamental ability to distinguish friend from foe, truth from lie, loyalty from betrayal. In a galaxy already drowning in suspicion and paranoia, the Alpha Legion made things infinitely worse. Let us now discuss in more detail the period between the Battle of Pluto and the Siege of Terra, because Omegon's actions during this critical period reveal much about the surviving twin's state of mind and his evolving relationship with the Cabal's prophecy. After Alpharius' death at Pluto, Omegon assumed his brother's identity completely. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Alpharius was still alive, still commanding the 20th Legion, still pursuing whatever inscrutable objectives the twin Primarchs had established. But internally, everything was different. Omegon was alone for the first time in his existence, carrying the weight of two identities and a burden that had been designed to be shared between two minds. The Cabal's prophecy had said that what Horus would do, Alpharius would undo. But Alpharius was dead. Did the prophecy still hold? Was it Alpharius specifically who needed to be alive for the prophecy to be fulfilled? Or could Omegon, wearing his brother's name, serve as a substitute? The Cabal, with their supposed ability to foresee the future, might have anticipated this possibility. Or they might not have. Their predictive abilities, while impressive, had been shown to be imperfect, and the death of one of the twin Primarchs at the hands of a loyalist brother was the kind of event that could throw even the most sophisticated forecasting model into disarray. Omegon's actions in the wake of Alpharius' death suggest a mind in turmoil. He withdrew the Alpha Legion from the main thrust of the traitor war effort, refusing to commit his forces to the Siege of Terra. He gave Horus the intelligence data on the Sol System's defenses, a gesture that appeared to support the War Master's cause, but then he took his legion and left, heading away from Terra rather than toward it. This was not the behavior of a loyal traitor, if such a contradiction in terms can be permitted. This was the behavior of someone who was no longer certain of the plan, who was hedging his bets, who was trying to keep as many options open as possible. Some scholars have suggested that Omegon, freed from the influence of his more aggressive brother, was returning to his natural inclination toward caution and doubt. Without Alpharius to push him toward the Cabal's path, Omegon may have begun to question the entire premise of their involvement in the heresy. Was the Cabal's prophecy truly reliable? Were the aliens' motives pure? Was the extinction of humanity really the only way to defeat chaos? These questions, which Alpharius' certainty might have suppressed, could have reasserted themselves in the aftermath of the twins' death. Rather than participating in the Siege of Terra, the Alpha Legion instead focused on delaying Robut Guilliman's advance toward the throne world. The Ultramarines Primarch, accompanied by the forces of the 13th Legion and elements of other loyalist formations, was racing toward Terra to reinforce the defenders. If Guilliman's forces arrived in time, they might be able to break the siege and save the Emperor. The Alpha Legion's strategy was to intercept loyalist vessels, particularly those of the Ultramarines, and force them into dangerous warp translations that would slow their advance, and all while avoiding being drawn into open battle. This operation is significant because it represents a clear, concrete action in support of the traitor cause. Whatever doubts Omegon may have harbored about the Cabal's prophecy, he was still willing to take actions that directly served Horus's strategic interests. By delaying Guilliman, the Alpha Legion was helping to ensure that the Siege of Terra would not be interrupted by loyalist reinforcements, increasing the chances that Horus would achieve victory. But was this truly what Omegon wanted? Or was the delay of Guilliman's advance serving some other purpose that we cannot perceive from our limited vantage point? With the Alpha Legion, there is always the possibility that the apparent purpose of an action is not its true purpose. That what looks like service to one cause is actually service to another. Perhaps Omegon was delaying Guilliman not to help Horus win the siege, but to ensure that Guilliman arrived at precisely the right moment, not too early and not too late, to achieve some outcome that the Alpha Legion had calculated with their characteristic precision. We will never know. The Siege of Terra ended with the Emperor's confrontation with Horus aboard the War Master's flagship, a battle that left Horus dead and the Emperor mortally wounded. Exactly the outcome that the Cabal had predicted if the Loyalists won. The Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne, the Imperium began its long, slow decline, and the Alpha Legion's gamble, if that is what it was, appeared to have failed. Or did it? The Cabal had presented the twins with only two outcomes.
Yeah, but there is a third possibility that the aliens may not have foreseen or may not have revealed. The possibility that the Imperium's decline is not inevitable, that the slow decay of the next 10 to 20,000 years might be reversed, that the Emperor might yet be restored or the Imperium reformed. If the Alpha Legion saw this third path, if they believed that the Cabal's binary choice was a false one, then their contradictory actions during the heresy might make a terrible kind of sense. By fighting on both sides of the conflict, by both supporting and undermining the traitor cause, the Alpha Legion may have been trying to achieve an outcome that fell between the two extremes predicted by the Cabal. Not a clean loyalist victory that left the Emperor on the Golden Throne and the Imperium in irreversible decline.
Not a clean traitor victory that wiped out humanity, but destroyed chaos. Something in between. Something that preserved humanity while also creating the conditions for chaos to be defeated by other means. Is this what the twin Primarchs were actually trying to achieve? There is no definitive evidence one way or the other, but it is a theory that accounts for many of the otherwise inexplicable aspects of the Alpha Legion's behavior during the heresy, and it is a theory that is consistent with the twins' documented tendency to see possibilities where others saw only binary choices. Now, let me expand on the aftermath of the heresy and the Alpha Legion's long journey through the millennia that followed.
Yet because the story of the 20th Legion in the age of the Imperium is every bit as complex and fascinating as their role in the heresy itself. When the heresy ended, and the other traitor legions retreated to the Eye of Terror to lick their wounds and plot their revenge, the Alpha Legion chose a different path. They did not retreat. They did not flee into the warp to be consumed by the very forces they had supposedly been trying to destroy. Instead, they dispersed into the galaxy, breaking apart into hundreds of independent warbands that scattered across Imperial space like seeds carried on the wind. This fragmentation was not a sign of weakness or despair. It was a deliberate strategic decision, one that had probably been planned well in advance of the heresy's conclusion. But the Alpha Legion had always been organized as a distributed network rather than a centralized hierarchy, and the dissolution of the Legion into independent warbands was simply the final expression of this organizational philosophy. Each warband was a self-contained unit, capable of sustaining itself, recruiting new members, conducting operations, and pursuing objectives without any external support or direction. The warbands established hidden bases throughout Imperial space. Some set up in asteroid fields, their ships concealed among the tumbling rocks where sensor scans were unreliable. Others found refuge in derelict space hulks, those massive conglomerations of wrecked vessels that drifted through the void like metallic tombstones. Still others established bases on barren, unpopulated worlds at the fringes of Imperial civilization, were worlds so insignificant that no one ever bothered to survey them closely enough to detect the presence of a small but lethal military force. From these hidden bases, the Alpha Legion warbands launched operations that ranged from small-scale sabotage to full-scale military campaigns. They attacked Imperial military targets that had been weakened by the heresy. They disrupted supply lines. They assassinated key Imperial officials. They fomented rebellions on worlds where the post-heresy Imperium's grip was weakest. And they did all of this while maintaining a level of operational security so extreme that the Imperium often did not even realize that the Alpha Legion was responsible for the chaos they were experiencing. But the Alpha Legion's post-heresy activities were not uniformly hostile to the Imperium. This is one of the most confusing and most frequently debated aspects of the 20th Legion's 10,000-year history. While some warbands were clearly working against Imperial interests, others seemed to be working in the Imperium's favor, conducting operations that weakened Chaos forces, disrupted Xenos threats, and even, in some documented cases, provided intelligence to Imperial commanders that allowed them to avert disasters they would otherwise not have foreseen. The explanation for this seemingly contradictory behavior lies in the Alpha Legion's fragmented nature. Without a Primarch to provide unified direction, each warband developed its own interpretation of the Legion's purpose and its own understanding of what the twin Primarchs would have wanted. Some warbands concluded that the best way to serve the Primarch's legacy was to continue fighting against the Imperium, either because they believed in the Cabal's prophecy, or because they had developed their own reasons for opposing Imperial rule. Others concluded that the Primarch's true loyalty had always been to the Emperor, and that the best way to serve their legacy was to protect the Imperium from the shadows, fighting against chaos and other threats without the Imperium's knowledge or cooperation. And some warbands simply pursued their own interests, using the Alpha Legion's skills and resources to carve out territories, accumulate power, and ensure their own survival in a galaxy that had become increasingly hostile. These pragmatic warbands were neither loyalist nor traitor in any meaningful sense. They were survivors, and adapting to a universe that had no place for them by becoming whatever they needed to be in order to endure. The diversity of the modern Alpha Legion is remarkable. Consider just a few examples. The Serpent's Teeth under Harrow Master Solomon Akura are perhaps the most powerful and organized warband in the current era, possessing the Pale Spear and pursuing objectives that seem oriented toward restoring the Alpha Legion to something approaching its former glory. The Shrouded Hand specializes in deep cover infiltration, maintaining networks of agents so extensive that some Imperial scholars believe they have penetrated every major institution in the Imperium. The Guns of Freedom foment revolutionary movements on Imperial worlds, destabilizing the status quo and creating opportunities for the Alpha Legion to exploit. But the Sons of Venom are known for their mastery of biological and chemical warfare, employing toxins and engineered diseases that bear a disturbing resemblance to the venom spheres that the Alpha Legion used during the Great Crusade. And then there are the outliers. The Penitent Sons, as I mentioned earlier, are openly loyalist and use self-inflicted pain as a form of penance for the Legion's traitorous past. They fight against chaos with a fervor that would satisfy the most zealous inquisitor, and they do so while wearing the mark of traitors, a contradiction that captures the essential absurdity of the Alpha Legion's post-heresy existence. The First Strike warband has embraced Khorne worship, becoming devotees of the Blood God while still retaining enough of the Alpha Legion's strategic sensibility to apply their violence with tactical precision rather than mindless savagery. The Faceless are perhaps the most disturbing of all the modern Alpha Legion warbands. They have taken the concept of identity substitution to its absolute extreme, to the point where the individual members of the warband have apparently abandoned all sense of personal identity. They do not use names. They do not acknowledge ranks or hierarchies. Each member of the Faceless is, in the most literal sense possible, interchangeable with every other member. They have achieved a kind of collective consciousness that goes beyond even the Alpha Legion's traditional emphasis on shared identity, becoming something that is more hive mind than military organization. The fact that these wildly diverse warbands were able to come together under Solomon Akura's leadership in the 42nd Millennium speaks to either Akura's exceptional leadership abilities or to the continued existence of some deeper unifying principle within the Alpha Legion. When the Ghost Legion coalition was assembled, bringing together loyalists, cornates, infiltrators, and identityless zealots under a single banner, It demonstrated that the bonds of the 20th Legion had not been completely severed despite 10,000 years of fragmentation. What prompted this reunion? Some sources suggest that the emergence of the Primaris Marines, the next generation of enhanced space marines developed by Archmagos Belisarius Cawl, using technology that dated back to the original Primarch project, was the catalyst. The Alpha Legion, with its deep knowledge of gene seed technology and its historical interest in genetic research, would have been keenly aware of the implications of the Primaris program. If the Imperium was creating a new generation of warriors that were superior to the original Astartes, the Alpha Legion needed to understand this new threat and adapt accordingly. But there may be another, deeper reason for the Alpha Legion's renewed activity in the current era. Roboute Guilliman has returned. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, the same being who allegedly killed the last surviving twin on the fields of Escrador, has been resurrected and now leads the Imperium as its Lord Commander. For the Alpha Legion, Guilliman's return represents both a threat and an opportunity. And a threat because the Ultramarines Primarch is one of the most formidable strategic minds in the galaxy, and he has a personal grudge against the 20th Legion. An opportunity because Guilliman's return changes the equation of the Cabal's prophecy in ways that no one, perhaps not even the Cabal itself, could have anticipated. The Cabal predicted two outcomes based on the heresy. One led to the Emperor on the Golden Throne, and the Imperium's slow decline. The other led to humanity's extinction and chaos's destruction. But the Cabal did not predict a third outcome, the return of a Primarch who could potentially reverse the Imperium's decline and chart a new course for humanity's future. Guilliman's return represents a variable that the Cabal's acuity did not account for, and a possibility that could invalidate both of the futures they presented to the twin Primarchs. If the Alpha Legion recognizes this, if they understand that Guilliman's return opens a third path that the Cabal never showed them, it could explain the increased activity and apparent coordination that has been observed in the 42nd Millennium. The Hydra is stirring. Something has changed in the calculations of the 20th Legion, and whatever that something is, it has motivated even the most isolated and independent warbands to begin working together again. What are they planning? What is the objective that has drawn the scattered heads of the Hydra back together? No one outside the Alpha Legion knows. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes the 20th Legion the most dangerous force in the current galaxy. But not their military power, which while formidable is dwarfed by the major factions of the setting. Not their intelligence networks, which while extensive are not omniscient. But their unpredictability. Their ability to act in ways that no one can foresee, for reasons that no one can fathom, toward objectives that no one can determine. The Alpha Legion is the unknown variable in every equation, the factor that no strategic model can account for. The card that no player knows is in the deck until it is played. They have been that way for 10,000 years, and they show no signs of changing. In a universe of war and certainty, they are the embodiment of uncertainty itself, a reminder that no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how thoroughly you prepare, there is always something you did not see coming. And somewhere in the galaxy, and in a hidden base or aboard a nameless ship, or disguised as an ordinary citizen of the Imperium, someone is watching, someone is planning, someone is waiting for the moment to act. The moment when the plan that was set in motion 10,000 years ago by two brothers who shared a single soul finally reaches its conclusion. I am Alpharius. This is a lie. Or maybe it is the truth. With the Alpha Legion, you can never be entirely sure. And that is the point. Let me close this extended exploration of the 20th Legion by returning to where we began. To the fundamental question that drives all discussion of Alpharius Omegon and the Alpha Legion. What were they really trying to accomplish? The honest answer, the only answer that respects the evidence and the ambiguity that surrounds it, is that we do not know. Well, we know what the Cabal told them. We know that they sided with Horus, at least publicly. We know that they fought on both sides of the heresy. We know that one twin died at Pluto, and the other probably died at Escrador. We know that the Legion survived, fragmented but functional, for 10,000 years. We know that they continue to operate in the current era, pursuing objectives that seem to serve no single master. But we do not know the why. We do not know the endgame. We do not know what the final move in the twin Primarchs' 1,000-year chess game was supposed to be, or whether it has already been made, or whether it is still to come. We do not know if the Alpha Legion's actions are guided by a coherent strategy, or are simply the random flailings of a leaderless force that has lost its way. And that uncertainty, that permanent, irresolvable ambiguity, is the twin Primarchs' greatest legacy. They created a legion that was designed to be unknowable, a force that operated in the spaces between truth and lie, loyalty and treachery, victory and defeat. They built something that could not be classified, could not be predicted, and could not be controlled by anyone, including, perhaps, themselves. In the grim darkness of the far future, where certainty is a luxury that no one can afford, and trust is a weakness that no one can survive, the Alpha Legion endures. They endure because they were designed to endure, because the philosophy of the twin Primarchs, the belief that identity is fluid, and truth is a weapon, and loyalty is a question rather than an answer, is perfectly suited to a universe that offers no solid ground on which to stand. Cut off one head, and two more take its place. Destroy one warband, and two more rise from its ashes. Kill one Alpharius, and 10,000 voices whisper, "I am Alpharius." The Hydra does not die. It does not retreat. It does not surrender. It simply adapts, and changes, and waits, and endures. Hydra Dominatus. And that, dear listener, is the story of Alpharius Omegon, the twin Primarchs, the Lord of Serpents, the head of the Hydra, the one soul in two bodies that became a legion of 10,000 souls, each one carrying within them a fragment of the mystery that the twins embodied. It is a story without an ending, because the Alpha Legion's story has no ending. It continues today, in the war zones and the shadows of the 42nd Millennium, in the actions of warbands whose names are known only to themselves, as in the operations of agents whose faces change as often as the wind. The twin Primarchs may be gone, or they may still be out there, watching from behind the masks that they wore so naturally and so well. We will probably never know the truth, and that is exactly how Alpharius would have wanted it. If you enjoyed this journey into one of the most complex and endlessly debatable corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore, I would be incredibly grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber, every like, every comment helps this channel grow and enables me to continue creating these deep dives into the stories and characters that make the 41st Millennium such a rich and rewarding universe to explore. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And consider sharing this video with anyone you know who might be interested in the mysteries of the Alpha Legion. The more we talk about these stories, the richer our understanding of them becomes, and I love nothing more than seeing the discussions that these videos generate in the comments section. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, in a universe where nothing is certain and nobody can be trusted, the only thing you can rely on is your own willingness to keep asking questions. I am Alpharius, and so are you.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.